Princess Lifla was a villainess who tortured an innocent girl and bossed a man around as she wanted. So she had a worthy villain's end. In a damp, stinking prison, she died after being cruelly tortured. The prince told the young lady that the selfish and greedy princess would not live long anyway, so she should not be sad. The prince's words became a consolation for her, who felt sorry for the villain, and she burst into even more bitter tears. The young lady was furious, because she was a fan of the elegant and noble princess. These words made her want to tear the book apart. This novel is about the love between the innocent protagonist Ariel and the crown prince Ravaloff. With her purity and received their love. Thus, the young and bright heroine was even able to defeat the villain. In the end, the young lady and the prince were able to have a magnificent and splendid wedding. The lady knew it would have been wonderful if it had ended with their marriage. But everyone was dead. She didn't understand why two of the three beautiful and charming secondary characters who fell in love with the heroine also died. And the third villain, Daniel, lost something very dear to him. She understood perfectly well that the main characters only harmed everyone. And yet, having read to the end, she furiously tore up all the pages of the book. She knew that if she were in a similar situation, she would definitely treat them fairly. But one summer day, she found herself in complete confusion, because she became Princess Lifla. No particular reason why she became a fan of the princess. She just liked her image. In addition, she is an icy creature, which distinguishes her from other villains. She did not lose her dignity, even being a villain. But in the last scene, her sympathy for her increased significantly when Ariel came to her in prison about the princess, sad about her imminent death, and told her something. The princess said that she was born a princess and would die one. She had no one who could love her. It was because of her mother. Because some actions forced half of their family to leave political activity, she was a villain, which doomed her daughter to a similar fate. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she did not understand this life. She knew that it was better for her to die as a villain than to die sick. Lifla said with a smirk that this was the reason she decided to be a real villain. Lifla told the young lady that she had enjoyed torturing her very much, as it amused her. In the second half of the book, it became known that the princess's life was limited. Lifla turned around and told Ariel that she ended up behind bars because of her decisions, and she didn't regret them at all. Smiling softly, she said that she did not regret what she had done for even a second. The young lady, in turn, happily recalled the plot of the book. After all, it was at this moment that the princess took the place of the main character in her heart. But a moment later, she sighed heavily, because she never wanted anything like this. One fine day, she opened her eyes and realized that she was inside a novella. Her memories of her past life were vague, but she knew for sure that she was not a princess. She clearly remembered the circumstances of her death, and she still remembered seeing the book with the novel, so she knew that the appearance was not hers. Her hair and eyes were not the same, and she had never heard praise for her appearance. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew that the princess was very beautiful, and, having no relationship, she died young. She was taken aback, because she realized that even if she avoided the outcome, she would still die. But she didn't want that at all. The young lady fell onto the bed with a thud. She was in despair. She sighed heavily and began to cry, as she understood that she had found herself in a hopeless situation. The young lady was puzzled. She wanted everything to go back to normal, so she spent a whole week in tears. Opening her eyes, she froze in place, because she thought she was still sleeping. The young lady was puzzled, because she had seen the princess in her dream. With the speed of lightning, she changed into a lyceum and looked at the princess with admiration. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked her in confusion why she called her Uni. She smiled and said that this address suited her very well. The princess sighed heavily and said that this was not the most important thing now. She looked at the young lady intently and said that she had listened to her attentively. The young lady said with a happy smile that she was listening to her. The princess said that she came to her to tell her how to get rid of the disease, because there was no other way but to endure the pain, because the disease was resistant to medicine. The young lady was puzzled. The princess asked in surprise, "Was it really not painful?" A moment later, the princess told the young lady that it was all because she was not the owner of the body. She looked at her in surprise and asked what her solution was then. The princess said that the flaw of this disease is that it is a disease of the soul, and this is the reason why it is incurable. She looked hard at the lady and said that it was both a decision and a reason why she had called her here. The young lady, in turn, froze in bewilderment. A moment later, she asked the princess in surprise why she had summoned her, and why her in particular. The princess said that she read the book, and then died. The young lady was very happy because she realized that she was very lucky. The princess sighed heavily and said that she should not die the way she had. The princess said that this disease takes away the soul. The princess smiled and said that as long as the body and soul are one, the disease will recede. The young lady sighed heavily and said with a smile that it was a relief. The princess told the lady that she would be sick of blood for a while. The young lady was taken aback and froze for a moment. The princess said that she needed to get her memories back within a year, but every time the memories came to her, she would vomit blood. Unfortunately, this procedure was destroying her soul. The princess said with a grin that she only had 100 days left, so she would have to find one every 3 days. The young lady was taken aback and trembling with fear, asking if she would be vomiting blood every few days. The princess smiled and said that everything was correct. The young lady was puzzled, because the princess spoke so easily about terrible things. Trembling with fear, the young lady asked if it was safe. The princess smiled and asked if it really mattered. As she left, the princess sighed heavily and said that the young lady only needed to be patient for 1 year. The princess said she would be sick until she merged with her body. Plus, if she vomited blood, then she was fine. The young lady was puzzled, wondering if the princess thought she had died from vomiting blood rather than from illness. The princess said that she was very kind, and in case she could not come to bring back the memories, she would make the memories come to her on their own. The princess looked at her with a grin and thanked her. She told the girl that perhaps she would not feel pain until she found the last memory. The young lady looked at the princess intently and said that she would like to ask her one question. She looked at the princess with admiration and asked how she could be so sexy and cold-blooded at the same time. The princess looked at the young lady with puzzlement and asked how she came across a creature like her. The young lady knew that this was much better than a book, because she was talking to the princess in person, and this situation made her feel special. In turn, the princess looked gloomily at the young lady, without saying a word. The young lady looked at the princess puzzled and asked what she should do with her body. She smiled and said bloody revenge in exchange for a new life. But in turn, she was not sure that bloody revenge was necessary, because there were many characters that she liked in the novel. She smiled and told the princess that she had done all she could. As she was leaving, the princess said that she didn't want anything like that. The young lady froze in place in surprise. The princess looked at her intently and said that she could live freely because now this was her new life. The young lady froze for a moment as a cold wind blew, and she dimly saw the princess. Finally, the princess said that she gave her an excellent memory of the original work that she knew, and all the memories would return in chronological order. A moment later, the young lady opened her eyes and froze for a moment. After all, at the princess's last words, she woke up. The young lady was glad because after meeting the princess, she had ended her week-long tossing and turning and decided to face reality. She knew perfectly well that she could perk up because one of the fatal endings had disappeared. The young lady was very glad that everything turned out this way. The young lady, in turn, knew the main events of the work, and with the participation of the main characters, the main events will begin in a few months. She knew the plot would be different from what she knew if she wasn't the villain. She understood perfectly well that even the slightest mistake could be fatal, because the crown prince was simply crazy. She knew that even if she left this place, she could still be destroyed, even if she didn't become a villain. But in turn, the young lady knew that there was one thing she had to do. She wanted to meet all the people she liked before the story began. Since the original source of the rumors about the villain was the princess's mother, no matter what she did, the situation did not change. She was going to leave this place after several months of interruption. So as not to provoke the crown prince, she needed to return the throne. After that, she wanted to meet her favorite main characters and also change the sad part of the original story. The final story begins at the moment when the main character arrives in the capital. The important thing is that many people died because the main character was possessed, and the main character was an innocent creature who didn't notice. The young lady was very saddened by this fact that evening. She liked those people very much, She did not want such an end for them. Sir Eugene Debolton, he spied on his sister Lifla, how much he was in love with the main character. He died in a trap set by the prince and out of jealousy. Duke Cain de Eric loved and protected Ariel, but lost her hand and his honor due to the envy of the crown prince. The head of the Information Guild, Heras, loved the main character very much and knew perfectly well that this was a trap of the crown prince, but still fell into it. Besides this, there was Lady Awen, who gave all her love and dreams as a true friend to the main character. Even Jane the maid, saved by the heroine, died because of her. She was confused because she knew that Daniel, the final boss, was a victim because he was crushed by them. He lost his dear friend Harris. She sighed heavily as she knew that Ariel was being used as a means of demonstrating wealth. The young lady was happy because she had read new things and knew about everything. She knew she had to protect herself before the story began. She understood perfectly well that the main characters were madly in love with each other and had to get married, regardless of her presence. She was puzzled because she knew that the only somewhat ambiguous character was Daniel. Daniel is a character who went missing after the final test for the main characters, the leader of the mercenary guild, and a friend of the second most important male character. The young lady knew that his true identity was a real mystery because nothing was said about his appearance, except that he was brown-haired. As the last of the royal line, they were captured and their country absorbed into the empire. The young lady was the only one who was worried about this meeting. She really wanted to postpone this meeting a little. She knew he had been a friend of Harris's when he was in the service, so she might cross paths with him regardless of her decision. She sighed heavily because she knew that when she met him, she would definitely find herself in the thick of things. After handing the documents to the princess, the maid asked her to rest. The princess smiled and thanked her. The maid bowed politely in response and left the princess. Recently, 3 maids, Linny, Erin, Emma, and her personal maid, have been in charge of her affairs. While she didn't realize that she had been in the book for about a week, she was absorbed in her experiences. During this time, Emma was worried about her, and therefore drove away the rest of the servants. But in turn, she sent only 2 maids to her, so the princess tried to be nice to them. She knew that the maid was the only one who stayed with her. She greeted them all with a smile. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily, as she was very tired. She was puzzled, because she understood that the disease would recede only when the fusion of soul and body was complete. Now she was in great pain. She knew that the princess was alone and often stumbled when walking. She was constantly pale and remained in a cold sweat. With dried blood in the corner of her covered mouth, she looked frightening, but there was a charm to it. The young lady, in turn, was glad that she had a chance to live a second life. She knew that she had to meet with the emperor to renounce her right to the throne, but she also knew that she had to see a doctor to confirm her diagnosis. Sometime later, she was in a hurry and looking for the doctor's office. After a long search, she finally managed to find the doctor's office. The man looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to see him in his office. He asked, puzzled, if something had happened to her. She knew that the princess had never consulted a doctor because she did not want anyone to know about her illness. She looked at the doctor intently and said that she had come to him to get tested for Ranua, and also asked if it was possible to do it now. She wanted to undergo a thorough examination, because with the help of this test, one can fully analyze the internal energy of the body. At the same time, only experienced doctors who know how to work with mana can conduct the test. And with the help of this test, it was possible to detect this disease. The man asked the princess if she was worried about what was going on, since she could have told him about her symptoms first. The princess sighed heavily and said that the symptoms were not quite normal, because she was losing her energy and getting tired very quickly. The man looked at her intently and said that he would like to hear more about her condition. She said that she was also vomiting blood. The man was taken aback and looked at the young princess in surprise. He did not expect to hear anything like that. A moment later, she presented him with the proof, the result, the restoration of the princess's memories when she was 1 year old. She looked at the man closely and said that other than that, there was nothing strange. He sighed heavily, looking at the princess, and invited her to sit down. Lifla looked at him intently and asked if it would take long. The doctor looked at her closely and said the test would take about half a day. The young lady in turn smiled sweetly and said that she understood everything perfectly. For this reason, she would wait, and he could boldly begin. Some time later, the young lady slowly opened her eyes. She was surprised, looked at the doctor, and asked if it was really all over. He slowly and quietly approached the door. She smiled and said that everything was fine, and he could tell her what was wrong with her. A moment later, she froze in shock as she saw the doctor close the doors. She was confused as she didn't understand what he was doing. A moment later, the doctor bowed before the young princess. She staggered, not understanding what was happening. He looked at her intently and called out. The young lady froze in place for a moment. The man sighed heavily and asked how she was holding up. The young lady was taken aback because she really didn't feel any pain. She understood that she could not describe what she did not experience. The man sighed heavily and said what the name of her illness was. And he also said that people like her are called angels' vessels. The young lady, in turn, only smiled warmly at the doctor. She didn't know what he was talking about, but it was funny. She was from another world, so she didn't see any sense in his words. The man jumped to his feet with lightning speed. She looked at him in surprise, and she knew that there was something she didn't know. The doctor sighed heavily and said that this was the disease mentioned in the poem. She was puzzled, because she understood that he could not simply hear her thoughts. She smiled and told Rox that she really hoped he could get rid of the anemia. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really meant that he should get rid of her. The young lady was well aware that if she was frequently anemic, it could become a big hindrance to her path as a fan. Lifla said she didn't want to make a stupid mistake because of her anemia in a situation where she needed to be extremely focused. Lifla said that it would be enough for her if she could endure a little tea party. She hoped that he would not refuse her. Rox said he had one way, but it could only be used a few times. She smiled, wanting to know more. Rox sighed heavily and said that he was talking about the black mamba's venom now. The doctor said that if she used it when she felt weak, she would be clear-headed for about half an hour. But on the other hand, the side effect of this drug can lead to a long sleep, but if she uses it for the third time, it will only poison the body. The young lady said with a happy smile that it was very good and she had found what she needed. Rox said he told her about it because it was the only way to get rid of the symptoms, but he wasn't sure if it was safe. He looked at her closely and asked if she was sure she wanted to use it. The young lady, in turn, wanted the medicine very badly. A moment later, the doctor fell to his knees in front of the princess. She was puzzled because she did not understand why he behaved in such a way. He said that the cure had not been discovered. She smiled softly and said that she knew it. Lifla understood perfectly well that the doctor was frightened because of the rumors about her. With lightning speed, the young lady sat up and told the doctor that he must calm down. Rox, in tears, told the princess that he was useless. She slowly approached him as she understood what the problem was. She looked at him with a gentle smile and said that everything was fine and he shouldn't blame himself because he had already helped her so much. The doctor looked at the young princess with tears in his eyes, as he did not expect to hear something like this. Raphael syndrome, a disease that, like a curse, is a disease of the soul, so there is no cure for it. No one knew what caused it, and it was just a slow death process. The only thing that is known is that after the death of a patient, those same flowers grow on his grave. Rox was well aware of her identity and all the horrible rumors. He understood that the servants were spreading various rumors about the princess. Rox was furious because he had previously prided himself on being able to magically cure everyone. He remembered the princess speaking with an icy calm and a warm smile on her face. Moreover, when he gave her a strong poison, seeing how sincerely happy she was, he could not hold back his tears. He was blinded by her radiance and hope as she reassured him. He knew that the princess spoke a little awkwardly, but very friendly. He realized that the princess already knew that she would soon die. He did not understand how she could be so calm. He sighed, because seeing her condition, he could only guess at the hardships of the years she had lived. He knew that there must be a strange book in the palace related to the elixir. He learned that this would allow him to move forward in his search for a solution. After all, there were legends about both the disease and the panacea, so he wanted to check everything and find out the truth. Sometime later, I looked at the pills, which contained both poison and blood-forming supplements in case of anemia. She realized that now she had nothing that could cause problems. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she now needed to move on to the next stage of her plan. Because of the right of succession to the throne, the prince tried to appear before the emperor. The prince was the man who never converted anyone, especially if someone managed to show a sign of attention or touch his property. The lady hoped that she could give the tough couple a slap on the back of the head and leave. She knew the problem was that no one could resist the addicted hero except Daniel. She knew she had to live as quietly as possible and not disturb him. She knew that even if she disappeared, she had to pass on her right to the throne. Right. Lifla knew she would need a lot of money when she left. She wanted to take some gold from the imperial palace. She knew that if that didn't work, she had a way to get money after she left, so she would have a secure life. The young lady looked into the distance, because she knew that she needed to sort this out quickly. Sometime later, she greeted the emperor at an audience. The princess bowed gracefully to the emperor. The young lady sighed heavily as she felt the emperor's cold gaze on her. He looked at her intently and asked what had happened. She knew that he didn't like the princess, but she knew that after today he would never see her again. She looked at the emperor intently and said that she would like to renounce her right to the throne. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she had just said. The princess repeated that she was renounced her right to the throne. She smiled and said that she would do it if he listened to her request. The emperor looked at her with cold fury because he knew that she had acted very insolently. He said that she really trusted in the strength of her mother. Unfortunately, the princess was unable to use her family's influence, despite the fact that her mother's family had made a huge contribution to the development of the empire. Unfortunately, many of the mother's family were forced to leave the political arena for the same reason that the princess became powerless. She looked at him intently and said that she would never do that. The young lady knew perfectly well that she had to tell the emperor her story. She said that he no longer needed to worry about her mother, because she, born from the mixing of blood, would soon disappear. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really telling the truth now. The young lady, in turn, looked at the emperor with a grin and said that she actually wanted to tell him something. She looked at him intently and said that, according to the doctor, she did not have much time to live. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked what kind of scam she was trying to pull off. The young lady bowed and said that she had no intention of doing anything of the sort, and that was the truth. He looked at her intently and said that she was indeed arrogant. He looked at her furiously and asked if she really thought he was so naive as to believe that. She didn't understand why the emperor would say something like that. She knew it was not normal to ask such a thing, even if he was sure she was lying to him. Lifla said that he could check it out if he thought she was lying to him. He smiled and said that he would definitely find out if she was telling him the truth. He looked at her with cold fury and said that, even if her words were true, it would be better for her not to think about asking him for anything. The princess smiled back, as she expected nothing less from a father who had never even given his daughter a name. She looked at him intently and said that if he gave her freedom, she would indeed renounce her right to the throne. Lifla said that she would leave the imperial palace. She just wanted some money for herself. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He was shocked because she was just going to leave. She said that in a few months, she would quietly leave the palace and live as if she did not exist. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was doing this. She knew she had to pretend to be gloomy and sad. Lifla said that she wanted to be free for at least a few years, and she had no other reason. The emperor sighed heavily and said that they could talk about this another time, but now she should return to her place. A few days later, the emperor called her to him again. During this time, she became a little closer to her personal maids. They satisfied her curiosity about a world that was new to her. The young lady, in turn, was happy because she came across very nice maids, but a moment later, her joy vanished. Recently, memories of the time when the princess was several years old returned to her. A moment later, the young lady stopped at the door of the hall. She looked at the door with a joyful smile, because she knew that when the emperor's meeting was over, she would hear his decision. The emperor looked closely at his daughter and said that her words were true. He looked at her intently and said that, in addition to the request she had made earlier, she could say what else she wanted. The young lady bowed and said that she wanted nothing more. She knew she shouldn't talk about money now. The emperor asked what she meant when she said she wanted to live in freedom. Lifla said that she would like to go to this quiet place where she can be alone and live without fear. The young lady looked at the emperor intently and said that she would certainly not enter into an official marriage. The emperor said that this was fine with him, but she must also belong to the imperial family as a princess and must stay in the imperial palace for 1 year. The young lady in turn froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He said that the political marriage was very important for their family, so in a year he would give her freedom, as she wished. The young lady was furious because the emperor wanted to keep her in the palace for a whole year. She knew she could stay for a few months, but not for a whole year, since she could not suddenly recover from a fatal illness. She understood perfectly well that the probability of life expectancy with this disease was only a few years. Lifla was furious because he was going to take 1 year of that time away from her. In the end, all her requests were ignored. The young lady was furious. She did not understand what he was trying to achieve. She sighed heavily, knowing she needed to calm down before she broke his neck. Lifla called the emperor, but he said that she must now leave. She knew that, unlike what had happened a few days ago, she had been put on display in a very pitiful manner. Some time later, the emperor sat quietly in his office. He remembered the look on his daughter's face as she left. He sighed heavily as he remembered the blood that had caked in the corner of her mouth. What he heard from the doctor was shocking to him. He was very surprised, because his daughter was one of those who suffered from a terrible, incurable disease. He understood that the doctor tried to find a cure by any means, but all was in vain. Unfortunately, he was never able to love the princess. His love, the light of his soul, died, and only her son Ravilof remained in his heart. The princess had always been a nobody to him. She was the daughter of a rare villain, but still her family had enormous power. That's why he never made taking care of the princess a priority. When he found out that she was ill, he could not throw her out the door as cruelly as before. Then she told him that she dreamed of freedom. If her words were the only ones, he would not listen to her. He knew that she had also calculated the benefits of fulfilling her wish, but in the end, he could not allow her to do so. He knew that she was very young and barely breathing. He knew that after a terrible struggle with pain, she would leave behind a small grave. He knew that flowers would bloom on the grave of a person who had suffered from this disease. Someone called them flowers of the soul that remembers the fleeting life and sings of its freedom. He sighed heavily, as he understood perfectly well that the princess repeated these words day after day. He knew she was very young, but she was already playing with her death. She just wanted to leave this place with her dignity intact. The emperor sighed heavily, for he understood that the princess was only a child, broken in solitude. He couldn't stop thinking about her, because he knew that if she left now, she wouldn't be safe, even if she lost her right to the throne. She had many enemies, but her mother never protected her and never will, and there is no one to take care of her. He knew perfectly well that he had never been involved in raising her before, but since she had turned to him, he would try to do everything possible for her. He knew that perhaps she did not like what he said, because it could be difficult for a young lady. However, he ordered her to stay for another year for the sake of the memories that were left here. He thought that if he let her go now, he would not be able to forgive himself. He sighed heavily, wanting to have a little more confidence when she was gone, knowing that after all this, he was the worst father. The count's daughter Ariel, being under the overprotection of her father, lived in safety. She was playing peacefully in the garden, but suddenly she heard some noise. During the game, a boy suddenly appeared in front of her, as if out of thin air. The boy was about 10 years old when he arrived at the estate, where he was called a fairy. He looked at her intently, and with a predatory smile asked if she was his. The young lady was so naive that she misunderstood the meaning of the boy's words. Then the young man saw the young lady blossom with an innocent smile. The young boy smiled contentedly, and for a moment was embarrassed by her radiant smile. Some time later, the young lady made her debut in high society. It was then that she learned that her fairy, whom she had not seen since she was 15, turned out to be the crown prince. The lady sighed heavily, as she knew that Ariel was simply a saint, simplicity, and the winner in the nomination of Miss Naivety. The maids were surprised, looked at the young princess, and asked what she meant. Lifla said she just wanted to know what she could do when someone opens the door to suffering. The maid smiled and said that when these doors opened, they would already escape. She smiled and said, "This door leads to trouble." She asked if she really took these words from a poetry collection. She said they had to escape before the doors opened. This was not her plan, but she could see that the maid had taken a liking to her. The maid looked closely at the princess and asked if something was bothering her. While sipping tea, the princess said that everything would be much more complicated than she had expected. Most likely, she will be killed by the crown prince on her way out of the palace, and this is all because she has the right to the throne. Unfortunately, the young lady is the only obstacle on his path to the throne. She would gladly throw this right in the crown prince's face, but she can't do it. She knew she had a few options. The first option wasn't that bad, but it was very random and easy to make mistakes. She looked closely at the maids and said that the second option was not such a minefield, but there was a high chance of a bad outcome. The maid looked at the young princess in confusion and asked if she couldn't figure out which one was better. The princess thought for a moment. She knew she had to meet Daniel, the man who was creating the final obstacle for the main characters. At the moment when they were about to get married, and then he laughed at the empire and disappeared forever, he was stronger than the crown prince. At the end of the story, he left the empire, but he always cared about the people who were around him. She knew that if she was under the young man's care, then he would protect her. The maid told the princess that she had said earlier that things could turn out very badly. She understood perfectly well that everything was exactly like this, because Daniel had a very dangerous character, and his current position was the leader of the mercenary guild. He truly hated the royal family. She knew she could only be in danger because of her relationship with the royal family. The maid sighed heavily, as she understood that this was all very difficult, but she would still choose the last option. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked why she would like to do that. The maid said that no matter how bad things went, if it worked, then it was worth trying. She knew it was better to rely on Daniel than to risk her life on the possible whims of the crown prince. With lightning speed, the young lady rose up. The maids looked at her in surprise. She looked at them intently and with a radiant smile thanked them for their sound advice. The maids looked at the princess with admiration, as they were blinded by her beauty. At the same time, the princess was sure of one thing. Memories would come to her regularly. She knew that the young princess was a dazzlingly beautiful child, but without emotion. She walked quietly through the corridors, not noticing anything around her. The young lady, in turn, admired the young princess, as she was small but still cute. She looked out onto the terrace with joy, because she knew that life was beautiful. The princess's memories gradually returned to her, and so she decided how she would act in the future. She knew she had to meet all the supporting characters, because they loved the main character, but were sacrificed. Some of the incidents were caused by the prince's obsession with her, who considered the main character his property. The young lady knew that the prince could not stand the fact that the main character had someone closer than him. She understood perfectly well that all the main character could do was feel sorry for people. She knew that the main character simply couldn't do anything, and therefore lost everyone who was kind to her. The young lady, in turn, understood that she needed to take action so that they would not become unhappy, as in the original. Eugene Debolton was recognized as a free knight and was also among the most powerful knights in the empire. For him, who came from the empire, there was only one limitation. In exchange for the support of the royal family, he was appointed as a knight in the princess's palace for more than 1 year. Since there were many rumors about the princess's devilish deeds, the young man had a bad impression of her. Besides, he hated the princess's coldness. The main character was her complete opposite, and that's why he fell in love with her at first sight. He was the first to fall into the prince's trap and die, so he will be the first one the young princess will contact. He had a goal he wanted to achieve before he was used by the prince and lost his life. In any case, the princess knew the knight's original goal, so she wanted to help him achieve his goal. She thought that he would be able to leave the palace without hesitation and roam the world freely. Lifla knew she could convince him if she showed him that she was different from the rumors. A moment later, the young man opened the door, and the young princess froze in place in embarrassment. Eugene looked closely at the princess and greeted her. She saw his beautiful silver hair and eyes, as if painted by a skilled artist. Noble and clear facial features. Lifla noticed that he looked very reserved, but he had thin, sensual lips that aroused desire. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something had happened. With lightning speed, the princess grabbed his hand. He was taken aback and asked in confusion what she was doing. Lifla thanked him with a joyful smile. The knight looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at him with a joyful smile, because she was grateful that he was born. She knew that he was an amazing person. She knew she had to bury all her dignity for a few months. Eugene looked at the princess with irritation, as he did not understand why she was doing this. She smiled and said he was amazing. He looked at her in bewilderment, as he didn't understand what had come over her. Lifla asked with a smile if he was free today. The princess said that there was one place she would like to visit today. She smiled and said that she really hoped that he would agree to accompany her. Eugene looked at her irritably, a puzzled expression on his face. Eugene looked coldly at the princess and said that she could just order him. He did not understand why she asked such a thing. He was a free knight who received the title of Silver Blade of the Empire. He would not be executed even if he showed his dissatisfaction to a member of the royal family. The princess smiled and said that of course she could order him, and she was not even surprised that he hated her. She smiled and said that she didn't want to offend him, and on her part, it was a request, not an order. The young man thought for a moment. The young lady froze from the beauty of the young knight. She looked at him intently, hoping that he would agree. He looked at her intently and asked what she would say if she did ask him to do something unpleasant. She said that if he didn't agree, she would still go herself. But the thing was that she really liked him. The princess looked at him intently and quietly said that he must be surprised. He smiled and asked if she hadn't said earlier that he hated her. The princess said that was exactly it. He smiled and said it was a heartbreaking confession. She knew he wanted her to feel insulted, but she was more tempted. The princess noticed that, surprisingly, he was not in a bad mood at all. He smiled and said that he couldn't help it, because that kind of confession was very sweet. He looked at the princess with a smile and agreed with her. Bowing, he smiled and asked where he should escort his beautiful princess. Lifla thanked him with a joyful smile. Eugene, for his part, knew perfectly well that if he did not want to compete with the duke, he would not have stayed here. He came to the imperial palace in search of an opponent who could raise his position. The empire gave him many advantages, but he was not interested in it. In the thick of things was the princess. There were many unpleasant rumors around her. She personally hoped that one day she would be killed. But today, he saw her radiant smile. The young man sighed heavily, as he was curious about what she would do next. He wondered how she knew that he hated her. He didn't know why. But she did things like that, and he wanted to see what could come of it. The young princess, in turn, had already chosen her true path, which was unpredictable. Emma told the princess that she should take one of the maids with her on a walk. The princess smiled and said that everything was fine, and she didn't need anyone, since Eugene Debolton had agreed to go with her. The maids froze in place for a moment in surprise, as they did not expect to hear such a thing. The maid looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she really meant a free knight. Lifla said with a smile that it was exactly like that. The maid was surprised, and at the same time excited, as she knew that the knight was simply a rude person. Linny, in turn, was very depressed. The princess smiled and said that everything was fine with her, so she asked him to come with her, and she was sure that they would have a good time. She also said that she had a map, so they did not have to worry about her getting lost. Emma looked at her worriedly, because she was afraid to let her go alone. The princess smiled and said that the knight was only here for a short time. She looked at them in surprise, as she noticed that they were too happy about it. A moment later, she turned around and said with a happy smile that it was time for her to leave. She wanted to go to a place that was very deserted, but for some reason few people knew about it, because there were many beautiful flowers and trees there. The princess showed the king a map that the servant had drawn for her. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this map had really been drawn by a servant. The princess smiled and said that everything was correct, but the map was still understandable to the will. Looking at the map, the knight said that she was right, but he still wanted to know why she wanted to go with him. The young princess, in turn, wondered if he was as afraid as she felt the anxiety in his speech. He looked at her intently and said that she shouldn't say that she liked him, because he wanted to know the real reason. She smiled and said that he shouldn't think too much, because it was pure sympathy and nothing more. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she had seen such a turn of events. The young princess, in turn, looked sideways at the young man with a smile on her face. The young princess looked at the knight with a satisfied smile and began to speak. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such a smile. She smiled as she saw that he was just a cute cat. A moment later, the princess informed her knight that they had arrived at the place. He looked at the princess intently, without taking his eyes off her. The princess, in turn, thought that he looked like some kind of domestic cat. But a moment later, she nevertheless noticed that he looked more like a noble silver wolf. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she said. The princess was taken aback and said with a smile that she had not said anything. A moment later, she said with a smile that her maid had indeed recommended a great place to stay. Smiling, she said that it was more comfortable here than she had imagined. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. Lifla said with a smile that even though it was an open area, it was very cozy. She said that she felt like there was a treasure island here. The knight looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that there was a hidden treasure island. When someone got there, a lot of beautiful things caught their eye. A moment later, she glanced sideways at the cozy tree. A few seconds later, the princess sat down next to the tree, and with a smile told her accompanying knight that he could sit down next to her. Eugene Debolton quietly asked her what she was even thinking. The princess smiled and asked what he had just said. Looking away from the princess, he said he hadn't said anything. He looked at the princess intently and said that she must get up for a minute, as she would get her clothes dirty if she just sat there. She looked at him in bewilderment. He was already sitting on the ground, but she still got up and said that everything would be fine if she now shook all the dust off her outfit. The princess knew that even here she had to remember her dignity. She froze when she saw that he had spread his handkerchief on the ground. Eugene Debolton said that now she could sit down with confidence. The princess was shocked by his actions and wondered if they really called him Casanova. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something had happened. The princess was blinded by his beauty. She smiled and said that his actions surprised her a little. Eugene Debolton sighed heavily and said that if she enjoyed it, she need not worry, because that was the way she was supposed to be treated. He looked at her intently and asked if he could now have an answer to his question. The princess smiled and said that he could sit next to her and they could talk. She asked if she should give him a handkerchief too. Eugene Debolton, looking away from her, said that he did not need any handkerchiefs because he was not a lady. The princess sighed heavily and said that she had thrown many people out of the palace recently because everyone said that they wanted to leave, so she showed them the door. He looked at her intently and asked if he said he wanted to leave, would she let him go? The princess smiled and calmly said that of course she would do it. She said that she had not taken away his freedom. He sighed heavily and asked if she really wanted to surprise him just to say that. The princess smiled and said that everything was true, but it would be very sad. Eugene Debolton looked at the princess with bewilderment, but a moment later, his face changing, he asked if it was really because she liked him. She smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and the knight, in turn, looked intently at the princess and said with a grin that he hated her. The princess said with a gentle smile that she knew about it, and that was why she liked him. The knight looked at the princess in bewilderment, as he had not expected such a thing. A moment later, he sighed heavily and asked if she really wanted him to come back. She looked at him intently and said that she did not expect him to return. The princess asked why he had come to the palace. He said that the strongest people in the empire were here. He was currently a knight of the imperial palace, but before that, he was on vacation. He returned to the palace to protect Ariel and stop Lifla. The strongest man he was about to meet was Duke Cain d'Iric. In the original, the crown prince took advantage of the differences between Eugene and Cain's personalities to sow discord between them. Unfortunately, they could not avoid a duel. No one emerged victorious. One lost his honor and his hand, and the other simply died. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked what he was going to do with the strongest people. Eugene smiled and said that he would like to fight them. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to fight until someone died. He sighed heavily and, looking at the princess with bewilderment, said that this was not a dogfight at all. She looked at him intently and said that she did not want him back, but wanted to see him free and not worry about anything. She smiled and said that whenever she saw him, he seemed unhappy. Eugene sighed heavily and said with a grin that she was close to the truth. She smiled and said that she really hoped that he would find a man who could satisfy him. A moment later, the princess stood up and picked up the handkerchief from the ground, saying that she would wash it and return it later. Eugene looked at her in surprise, as he had not expected such a thing. A moment later, the young man laughed hysterically. He asked the princess if she was joking. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was laughing at. She looked at the handkerchief in surprise and asked if she could just give it to him. Eugene, in turn, burst into laughter and could not answer the princess clearly. At the same time, the doctor was puffing over the books. He wanted to thoroughly study the incurable disease and find out the truth about the Trojan fruit. Unfortunately, he had been very busy for the past few days. He could do nothing, since he had to pretend that he was studying, and he also asked not to spread the word. However, he visited the place where some of the most outstanding minds of the empire were gathered. The young man looked at the doctor intently and said that he might know. Rox looked at him intently and said that if he knew anything, he should say it. He pleaded with the young man as he couldn't wait to hear the information. Ripley frowned for a moment and looked at the doctor intently, asking if what he had heard was true. He wanted to know if the princess really did have an incurable disease. Rox looked at him intently and said that he should keep quiet about it. The young man also called the princess an ice cube. Rox was furious. He did not understand how he dared to call a sympathetic girl that way. He told the young man that he should see her with his own eyes. A moment later, he began to cry, as he remembered the moment when the princess learned of her illness. The young man was puzzled. He did not understand what it was about the princess that made him behave in such a way. Rox sighed heavily and said that she had won over such an old man with her kind touches and timid smile. He looked closely at the young man and said that in his life, he had already met people who reacted to death in the same way, but they lived long lives. He said that the young princess was very young. Unfortunately, they could not predict her thoughts. He asked the young man if he really thought that this research was meaningless. Ripley bowed low and asked for forgiveness, for he had said too much. But this was only because he did not understand why the doctor was going so far. The doctor looked closely at the young man and thanked him for his understanding. Ripley said that he wanted to help him, and also said that he wanted to talk about Duke Eric. He said that, according to rumors, the Trojan fruit is not a fruit at all, but rather a flower. He sighed heavily and said that they had no way to verify this, but the informant was that person. He said that he was talking about the Duke now. However, this is only his assumption, because until today, the appearance of the Trojan fruit has been recorded only a few times around the world, and all its trees had the same feature. He sighed heavily and said that there was always a black-haired man nearby, and before they appeared, the area around was shrouded in an intoxicating smell. Ripley. Looking at the doctor, he said that he checked several places and people, based on the given clue. Among them was the Duke. In turn, he was extremely suspicious. Ripley said that the Trojan fruit was a real holy grail, a medical man's average herb, and he said this only because his research was motivated by personal interest. The doctor said with a smile that it did not matter, and thanked the young man. The doctor asked him if he should see the Duke. The young man said that it was exactly so, but he must control himself. Unfortunately, there were many rumors about the man's danger, and it was even said that he was the descendant of demons. The doctor looked at the young man with a joyful smile and thanked him, and also said that he would be careful. The young man looked at the man in surprise and said that he had not done anything wrong, but was still glad that he could help the princess. At the same time, a man was watching them, standing quietly behind the door. The lady was surprised that the princess was on the verge of death. She was puzzled because she did not hear what fruit they were talking about. From their conversation, the girl understood that the princess would soon die. The opposite of Eugene, Cain. An attractive man with black hair and black eyes, deep, sad eyes that held a story. His whole appearance resembled a vampire, but he was described as an honest and straightforward man. The princess looked at the young man and asked if the palace was getting on his nerves. He smiled and said He thought they could take a walk around the place and not get bored and stuck in one place. She smiled and said she understood. A moment later, the princess staggered as she felt ill. Eugene looked at her in surprise and called out. She sighed heavily as she realized that her pale face would give away her condition. Lifla said, with an innocent smile, that it was all because of her low stamina. Eugene smiled and said that now he understood everything. The young lady was puzzled and touched by his words, because due to the smashing smile, she could not collect herself. Eugene looked at her closely and asked worriedly if she was all right. Staggering, the princess said that she was fine and they could continue their walk. He sighed heavily and looked closely at the princess. A moment later, he politely put his arm around her shoulder. She was puzzled because she felt like her heart was about to break and she would faint without having time to create anything. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should come closer to him. The princess looked at him tenderly and embarrassedly and said that she was indeed fine. She knew perfectly well that she needed to change the subject of the conversation as quickly as possible. She thought for a moment because she didn't know what to do, but after a few seconds, an idea came to her mind. A moment later, she handed the knight a cleanly ironed handkerchief. She smiled and said that she would like to give him the handkerchief that he had lent her last time, since she had even ironed it herself. The young man burst into hysterical laughter. She looked at him intently and asked if he had heard of Duke d'Iric. Eugene froze for a moment. After a few seconds, he said that he had heard his nickname, and everyone called him the Dark Knight. She understood that he was pretending to be ignorant, although he came here after hearing rumors about the strongest knight in the Empire. Lifla said that he was a man who preferred to leave things in places that were only accessible to members of the royal family, a man who was difficult to meet unless he came himself. Eugene looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess looked at him intently as she saw that he was pretending not to know what she was talking about. She knew that he was dazzlingly cute right now. She smiled and said that he had said that before because he himself wanted to fight the strongest opponent, and she thought that if it was him, then he was a very good opponent. She smiled and asked what he thought about it. Eugene beamed and said that of course he thought it was a very good idea. Lifla said with a smile that it was wonderful, and so they should go. He smiled and thanked her. A moment later, they came to an empty tower. The Duke's office was located in the Black Tower, next to the library of the Imperial Palace. It was a place where only those who belonged to the imperial family were allowed to enter. This was information that insiders like Eugene could not know. In the original, he only met him when the prince was in the forest in the relationship between them. The princess looked at him intently and asked if she could ask him for a favor. He looked at her in surprise but still agreed. The young lady began to speak, but stopped and looked away, not knowing how to finish. The young princess really wanted to get his autograph. She wanted him to take her hand so she could feel his large, strong muscles. She looked at the young man intently and wondered if he would ever take her hand first. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to take her first. The young princess timidly said that it was so. She assumed that she could leave the palace in early or late autumn. Then her dress would have sleeves. He looked at her in surprise and asked if her sleeves were really for this. He looked at her intently, not daring to do something like that. The princess was furious, as she realized that she had spoken about this too soon. She smiled and said that she asked for it because she liked him, but she didn't want to cause any problems. She smiled and said that it was because they would not have so much time, and she was very sorry that he would leave the palace after meeting the Duke. She smiled and said that he didn't have to bother himself with it. She knew that she said that because she had little time left, and she acted thoughtlessly. She wanted to try asking him next time. The young princess, in turn, looked awkwardly at the young man, waiting for his answer. He muttered quietly that he did not understand her, but a moment later, bowing, he said that he would gladly do whatever she asked. The young lady was amazed. She looked at the knight with a joyful smile and thanked him. A moment later, she approached the door in high spirits, for she had not expected anything. But luck smiled upon her. She slowly opened the door, as she knew that the Duke did not like it when people knocked. She froze for a moment as she heard a conversation. The princess looked into the room in surprise, as she saw the doctor kneeling before the Duke and saying that he really needed the Trojan fruit. He begged the Duke to help him, and also said that he would be in his debt to him. The young lady was puzzled, because she did not understand why the doctor was now in the Duke's room. Rox sighed heavily and asked the Duke for forgiveness, because he realized that his actions were impolite. He sighed heavily and said that he would ask about it according to the Emperor's decree. Eugene slowly approached the princess and quietly asked what she was looking at so intently. The princess quietly told him to be quieter. A moment later, they both watched the conversation intently. Rox sighed heavily and said that he needed a fruit for Raphael's disease. Eugene turned around with lightning speed and looked at the princess with a puzzled look. The young lady was shocked. She knew that she didn't care at all whether he told her about her illness, but she didn't think she would hear about it like this. She understood that the doctor did everything for her. The Duke looked at the man in surprise and asked why he was asking him about the legendary fruit. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. She did not understand what was happening, because she saw that the Duke was definitely her type. She knew that Eugene was also handsome, but the Duke was definitely her type. She thought he was like a bouquet of black roses. Although he was pale and gloomy, his melancholic eyes made her heart tremble. She knew that a handsome man with a dangerous aura was the best. She saw a man with long hair who looked better than a work of art. The Duke heard a noise outside the door and looked at the princess puzzled. She was surprised because he was looking straight at her. The doctor looked at the Duke intently and said that this was his last hope. With lightning speed, he stood in front of the Duke and asked him for help, because he needed to get only one fruit. The young lady was very angry with the doctor, because he was blocking her view. The young man looked at the doctor and said that it was all true. The doctor beamed with joy as he hoped for help. The Duke said that, unfortunately, he knew nothing about the fruit, and he also said that he should leave if he had no more business. The young princess, in turn, froze in embarrassment. She saw that he was very attractive and had everything. She saw that he was very elegant, and it seemed to her that she would die of admiration. The young lady turned around and looked at the knight in surprise. He went to the door and, asking for forgiveness, closed it. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because she did not understand what he was doing and why he did not allow her to look at the young Duke. She was shocked and wondered if she really looked like a pervert now. Eugene looked closely at the young princess and apologized for his rudeness. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later he picked her up in his arms. The princess was shocked. She did not understand what was happening and why he did something like that. She was confused because his face was very close to hers. She froze in shock as she saw his beautiful chest up close. He looked at her intently and said that he had only just noticed that she had injured her ankle on the way here. The princess looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. Eugene sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he was inattentive. He said that she might be a little uncomfortable, but she should lean on him. She was surprised and did not know the reason, but she knew that all his words were true. Lifla lowered her head to hide her wicked smile. She knew they had to go back, as the Duke had another guest. The young princess was not upset, as she knew that this walk was very memorable. He looked at the princess intently and said that he would not ask if she was okay. He also said that he did not hear anything, so she did not need to worry. The princess looked at him in surprise, but did not answer. A moment later, she still thanked him. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she knew that this was the surest answer. She looked closely at his radiant and beautiful smile. She knew perfectly well that she could spend a whole week without anything, just to look at the beautiful portraits of Eugene and Kane. In that case, she would have liked to stay in the palace longer, but she knew that it would not work. She smiled and said that she really liked him. The young lady looked at the young knight in surprise, not understanding what was going on with his expression. She wondered if she was really that heavy. A moment later, she said that they were almost there and she could now walk by herself. Eugene said that there was still a long way to go, and he would let her go after they had gone a little further. But he also said that there was something else he wanted to ask her. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked why she was behaving like that. The princess looked at him in bewilderment and asked what she had done. He looked at her in surprise and asked if he and leading her by the arm were really her only desire. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. He looked at her intently and said that she was saying that there was nothing else she wanted so much. She timidly looked away from him and said that it was all true. Staying away from her is what she once wanted for him, but she hasn't been able to say it since. Eugene looked at the princess intently and said that he was now her knight. And in addition to this wish, if she had anything else in mind, she could order him and he would do it. Thinking about his words, she understood what he was thinking. Eugene tends to mistrust women in everything. He probably thought she had an ulterior motive when she asked to take his arm. A moment later, the princess smiled and said there was something else. He looked at her closely and said she should tell him about it. She looked at him timidly and shyly offered to hold hands. A moment later, the young man carefully set the princess on her feet. He looked at her with surprise and confusion and asked if she really wanted to hold hands. He didn't want to do that with the princess. She knew perfectly well that he would never agree. She smiled and said that, although she liked him, she did not have any romantic feelings for him. She smiled and said that if he was so worried about such a thought, then she could reassure him, because she only wanted to be friends with him. He sighed heavily and said he was picking her up. A moment later, the young man looked at the young princess with a smile and said that if she did not ask in the future, he would protect her. The princess froze for a moment, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that he would do this at least while he was in the imperial palace, and he now wanted to swear his honor to her. The young lady was shocked that he announced his return, because she knew that he had previously said that he was currently in the imperial palace. She looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile, and Lifla, in turn, felt relieved. Eugene smiled a bright smile and said that there was no need to thank him, and he also said that she should now return safely. The young princess froze in place. As his eyes were shining, Eugene could smile without thinking about anything like that. She understood that anyone could take him for a Casanova with such a smile. Today, her heart was bursting. Of course, he was used to being the center of attention and immediately became sensitive to it, to be loved. He could get it easily without even trying. But in turn, he understood that the princess was a little different. He didn't know why, but he felt that she genuinely liked him. However, it was quite strange, and he felt it, because when they first met, the princess was clearly not interested in him. He didn't understand what had changed now, but he knew that as long as he had doubts like that, he had to be on his guard. Then she said that everyone wanted to leave, and she let them do it. He knew that, although the princess looked carefree, it seemed to him that she was very lonely. But still, it didn't matter to him. He smiled and asked, what if he said he wanted to leave? He wondered if she would let him go. The young lady looked at her knight with a radiant smile and said that of course she would let him go. Then he was very surprised that she answered without hesitation. To some extent, it was like an order to leave. Eugene looked at her in surprise and asked if she really brought him to this place to tell him about this. He was surprised, because she said without regret that she was letting the free knight go. The princess smiled and said that it was so, but she would be very sad. Eugene saw that the princess was sad. He knew that it was a feeling that had no ulterior motive. However, he could not ignore the possibility of another secret plan. Then he said that he did not like her. The young princess was not at all upset when she heard this, but with a gentle smile, she said that she still liked him. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was not that important, and she also told him that she suddenly realized this after letting many people go. Eugene could not believe her if people were as indifferent to him as the princess was in the past. But everyone felt a flat wish for him. She made a request of him, which he, unfortunately, could not fulfill, because she asked to hold hands. He thought it was temporary, but the princess continued to persist, contrary to his expectations. He was surprised, because she only wanted to hold hands. Eugene was surprised when she said that she liked him, but she did not have any romantic feelings for him. Lifla said with a smile that if such a thought was troubling him so much, then she would hasten to reassure him, because she only wanted to be friends with him. When he realized that her feelings were not filled with desire, the wariness that had been overwhelming him disappeared, as if it had never been there. He wondered if he had misunderstood her, because he had believed the rumors. He was puzzled and wondered if the princess had really changed. Unfortunately, he didn't know the right answer, But he was sure of one thing, that she was very funny. He couldn't think that liking someone could be so innocent. The reason he felt like it was pointless to be cautious was because he had never been a friend to the opposite sex. But he still thought it wouldn't be that bad. At the same time, the Duke sat quietly in his office and recalled his conversation with the doctor. As he left, the doctor looked closely at the Duke and asked him to let him know if he found any information. The Duke, in turn, wondered if the doctor had really spoken of Raphael's illness. The doctor left after he had sobbed and told him everything in great detail. The Duke sighed heavily, for thanks to the doctor, he had learned something he should not have known. He understood that the princess had heard about her illness earlier than was necessary. He remembered the princess he had only seen briefly. Today, he realized the fact that the rumors that she was like an ice queen with an icy heart were a lie. He saw her bright, rich smile, though her expression darkened after she heard the doctor's words. The Duke, in turn, was a little tense, since, unfortunately, he could not concentrate on work. He realized that even though they weren't close, it was still hard to ignore the pain that had befallen the other. He realized that it was better for him not to think about such things. A moment later, Eugene knocked on the office door. He looked closely at the Duke and asked if he had returned home. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise and asked who he was. Eugene smiled and said that this was the first time he would introduce himself in person. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise and asked if he had any business with him. Eugene smiled and told the Duke that he was as straightforward as the rumors said about him. Eugene looked closely at the Duke, because he noticed that they were the same age, but the Duke acted like a middle-aged man. The Duke looked at the young man with cold fury and wariness, because he did not understand why he knocked, because the door to the office was open. Eugene looked at the Duke and said that he wanted to talk about what the doctor had said, and he also asked the Duke if he could tell him his name. The Duke said that the man was a doctor in the princess's palace, and since he was spending time with the princess, he should have met him by now. Eugene smiled and thanked the Duke for telling him everything. He looked at the Duke intently and asked if he had just sent away someone who had acquired important information. The Duke looked at the young man in bewilderment, but said nothing. The Duke stood still for a moment, considering the situation. Eugene looked at the Duke intently and said that as an attendant knight, he had to protect his lady. The Duke looked at the young man closely, for he knew that he was shirking his duties but bluffing in front of others. He held it. He sighed and said that it didn't matter at all, because he knew that if the doctor wanted to prevent rumors from spreading, he should have gone to his grave with this information, because there were no secrets in the imperial palace. Eugene looked at the Duke with puzzlement, for he could not deny it. The Duke looked at the young man closely and said that he had no reason to blame himself for that, since the doctor had only spoken of what His Majesty approved of. Eugene was puzzled, since he knew that the doctor should have simply done his own research. The Duke looked closely at the young man and said that the princess probably had not intended to keep it a secret from His Majesty from the beginning, and if the doctor had been careful, information about the princess would not have spread so quickly. He looked at the knight closely and said that the previous circumstances were just a coincidence. Eugene sighed heavily and said that he hoped so. A moment later, he bowed and said that it was time for him to leave. The Duke sighed heavily, for he had heard from various sources that he was a carefree man. The Duke realized that the rumors about the young knight were unfounded, and the rumors that he hated the princess were a complete lie. However, the rumors did not spread as the men thought. The more the rumors spread among the servants, the more ridiculous they became. The maids said that the princess tried to commit suicide. The men, in turn, said that this was precisely the reason why she had recently locked herself in her room, and they wondered if she was doing this in order to maintain peace in the imperial palace. And once the rumor spread, every time they passed from mouth to mouth, the story turned into something even more outrageous. They said she would become like poison if she remained in the country. A little sympathy and anger was added to the facts. The maids with tears in their eyes said that the princess intended to go far away and live alone. And later, the rumors took on more and more outrageous forms in the imperial palace. Lifla slowly opened her eyes and felt that her body was very heavy. She was puzzled because she did not know how long she had slept. The maid was alarmed by the princess's condition. The young princess looked at her maid in bewilderment and asked if something had happened, since she saw that she was in a hurry. The maid, bursting into tears, told the princess that she had not opened her eyes in the morning and was very pale, and even broke out in a cold sweat. She looked at the princess intently and said that she had been unconscious all day. The princess, in turn, was very surprised by such information. The maid looked at the princess intently and said that she would immediately call the doctor so that he could examine her. The princess, in turn, was confused because she did not understand why she had slept all day. A moment later, the doctor burst into the room in tears and called for the princess. He hurriedly sat down next to the princess's bed. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay. Rox, bursting into tears, told the princess that he was completely okay. Lifla, in turn, was afraid that the doctor might get hurt while running around because of her, because she understood that he was no longer young. She looked at the man closely and told him that he did not need to overexert himself, because the young lady understood that she would soon feel better, even if he did not worry about it. Rox looked closely at the princess and agreed with her. She smiled and asked what had happened already. The princess looked closely at everyone present and asked with a smile if they were really saying that she had slept all day. She sighed heavily and said that she must be very exhausted. The young lady looked at everyone present in surprise. She didn't understand what was wrong with them and why their moods suddenly became dark. Rox looked at the princess intently and said that her body could not withstand the severe psychological shock. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She wondered if she had been shocked when she had admired first one handsome man and then another. He sighed heavily and said that anemia was also one of the symptoms. The young lady was shocked by everything that was happening, and this situation was very embarrassing to her. The princess started talking about how he went to the Duke yesterday. The doctor said that this was not something she needed to remember. The young lady was shocked. She didn't know how to explain the situation. She sheepishly said that yesterday she saw several amazingly handsome men. She knew that she just needed to tell them the truth. They looked at the princess in surprise, as they did not understand what she was talking about. Bursting into tears, they told her that she did not need to find an excuse for this. The young lady was shocked as she saw that they did not believe her. A moment later, Eugene looked at them intently and asked if it was true. Lifla froze for a moment. She didn't understand when he appeared in her room. The young man looked closely at the princess and winked at her playfully. Rox looked closely at the young man and asked if this was true. The princess froze for a moment because she did not understand why the knight winked at her. Eugene looked at everyone present and said that this was so because the princess had been with him all day. Everyone present froze in place for a moment, from shock and surprise. They could not utter a word. The princess, in turn, was trembling, barely holding back her laughter. She wondered if he had really looked at her like that in order to calm her down. She sighed heavily, as she knew she couldn't laugh properly, because they were all in the room with very serious faces. The doctor looked closely at the young man and said that if this was exactly how it happened, then he understood why the princess found herself in such a state. She looked closely at everyone present and asked if the pigs would be okay if she rested a little. She looked closely at the knight, as she knew he was devilishly handsome. Lifla sighed heavily as she was having a lot of fun and couldn't help but laugh. Without looking at the knight, she said that she would control herself. The maid and the doctor looked closely at the young princess and asked her to rest. Eugene looked intently at the princess and, bowing, said that in that case he would also be leaving. A moment later, the princess was left alone in the room, and she slowly covered herself with a blanket. And after a few seconds, she burst into wild laughter under the blanket. She laughed so long that tears came to her eyes. Slowly, they all returned to their place. The maid quietly asked the knight if he was returning back. He said that he was not yet. A few seconds later, the maid turned around with lightning speed and, looking at the knight, asked if it was true that he was with the princess yesterday. Rox was a little surprised and confused. He didn't understand what came over them and begged them to calm down. Eugene looked at the maid with a grin and said that he needed to tell them something. A couple of days after this incident, the princess was still resting in her bed. Rox earnestly begged the princess to rest for at least a few days, and she had no choice, so she had to stay in the room. The young princess sighed heavily as she felt that she had recovered enough. She was completely fine, but no one believed her. A moment later, the young princess sighed heavily and wondered if she had become so bored that she could already hear the voice of her knight. But a moment later, she clearly heard the knight's voice and saw him with the speed of lightning. She jumped up and looked at him in surprise. She looked at the knight in surprise. As she saw that he suddenly darkened and his expression changed, he looked at her closely and said that she had turned pale again, so he needed to call a doctor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady was shocked because she knew that this body was very fragile. He walked slowly towards the door, but the young princess still asked him to stop. She smiled and told the knight that the doctor had just visited her and he had already given her medicine. Lifla smiled and said that he didn't need to worry about it. Eugene turned around with lightning speed and said that he thought it was something to worry about. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected to hear such a thing. The young princess looked at the young man and said shyly that she was really very grateful. She couldn't believe that such a handsome man like Eugene would be so concerned and caring about her. She was very grateful to him for existing. She looked closely at the knight and asked with a smile what brought him here besides that. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was uncomfortable with him visiting her while she was sick. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not that simple. She was worried that she might cause him problems. He looked at her in surprise and, sighing heavily, asked if it was because he was leaving soon. The young lady in turn was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She wanted very much for him to settle all his affairs with the Duke as soon as possible. She wanted very much for him to avoid the original terrible scenario. He looked at her intently and, sighing heavily, said that he understood everything. Bowing, he asked for forgiveness for disturbing her at such a late hour. Lifla embarrassedly said that he did not need to ask for forgiveness, and in turn, she was very grateful to him for his concern. He looked at her intently, as he was surprised, but still said that she should take care of herself. The young princess looked at the knight with a joyful smile, as she wanted him to return back safe and sound. Linny walked into the kitchen with a happy smile. Theo greeted the young maid with a smile. She looked at the cook with a joyful smile and asked if dinner was ready for the princess. Theo looked closely at the young princess and said with a smile that dinner was being prepared, and she should wait a little. A moment later, he looked at the maid in surprise and asked why she had come alone. The young lady pouted a little and asked if he really thought she would do anything. Theo sighed heavily and said that he wouldn't have asked if he was afraid that she would make a mistake. He sighed heavily and asked if she didn't know how terrible the princess was. The young maid sighed heavily and, puzzled, said that of course she knew about it. She had heard that the princess got rid of people who did not please her. The princess only had to look at someone intently and angrily, and then the servants would freeze in horror at her gaze. He looked at the young maid intently and said that she would be in big trouble if she made a mistake. Linny sighed heavily and casually said that she had already made mistakes. Theo looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked away, not knowing how to answer. She said she made her first mistake when she stepped on the princess's fancy dress, and she also said that the foundation stepped on the princess's dress the next day. Theo was taken aback and excitedly asked the young maid how many times she had stepped on her payment. She sighed heavily, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and asked if it was really a ghost in front of him. The maid looked at the cook intently and said that the princess had told her to be careful, and that was all. He looked at the maid in surprise and asked why this had happened. He was puzzled and simply could not believe what he heard. Linny in turn turned around and said that the rumors were a little exaggerated. In the past, the princess was cold-blooded. She was more like an indifferent master, as expected from a member of the imperial family. If you get closer to her, you can feel the cold. But still, the princess never had a bloodbath in her palace. Linny thought that it depended most of all on the servants, who did everything possible to protect themselves. She knew perfectly well that when she worked, there were no of the terrible events that were rumored. She had only recently begun to get used to work when she began to look after the princess. She really made mistakes many times, but the princess never lost her composure. Sometime later, rumors spread that the princess had gone crazy. Everyone was reluctant to talk about the princess, so she decided to volunteer for the palace. In the palace, she found out that the rumors were a lie. She met the beautiful princess, and also the workers who supported her and took care of her. Theo, in turn, looked at the young maid with bewilderment. He did not understand what she was talking about at all, because he knew about the princess. The young maid turned around, and looking at the cook, said that in fact the princess was a very good person. She looked at the man intently and muttered quietly that he didn't need to worry about anything. He was surprised, as he didn't expect to hear something like that. The young lady, in turn, was embarrassed when the conversation turned to the princess. She looked intently at the cook and told him to hurry up and prepare the food quickly. A moment later, she checked her dinner and noticed that today's portion was small. He looked closely at the young maid and said that he knew why, but it still made his job easier, even though he had to pay more attention to detail. The young lady, in turn, wondered whether beautiful people really eat so little. Lifla looked at the maid with a gaze and thanked her with a smile for her efforts in working. She smiled and said that if the princess ever needed her, she could call her at any time. The princess looked closely at the young maids with a gentle smile. Eugene looked closely at the young princess and said that the maid was similar. She worked very hard. The princess looked at him sideways and asked with a smile if this was true. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that. To his surprise, a few days after this incident, Eugene visited the princess in the imperial palace. He came exactly when she was supposed to take her prescribed medications. She saw that he was cold, but at the same time he was friendly to her. When she expressed her love for him, he sheepishly said that he was the one with whom she was on different levels. But in turn, he told the princess with a dazzling smile that he could understand what she felt, because he was a sweet and wonderful person. The young princess looked at the young knight with a smile. As she could handle this level of tomfoolery, it reminded her of the saying that a young man is handsome on the outside, but ugly on the inside. But thanks to her knight, she was not bored and had a good time while she was sick. He looked at her intently and said that the atmosphere of the palace seemed to have changed a little over the past few days. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He smiled and said that if she looked relaxed, the servants would feel more comfortable. Although such servants were in the minority, the young lady knew very well that if this was the case, then this was very good news. She hoped that she would have a chance to change the princess's reputation as a villain. The previous princess was not the type of person who simply tormented those weaker than her, Lifla said, with a smile that she felt relieved now. She knew perfectly well that if she thought it through, she would soon be able to clear her reputation, and she froze for a moment when she saw the beautiful and sweet smile of her knight. She quietly muttered that she could now die without regrets. Eugene looked at the princess with excitement and surprise, and asked what she had just said. She was taken aback, as she understood that now was not the time for this. Eugene looked at the princess and asked if the reason this place had changed was because its owner had changed. She smiled and said that she thought so. She knew that it was true because that princess was no longer here. Eugene looked at the princess intently and asked if he could ever serve her again. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him in surprise. She was shocked because she did not understand why he would arbitrarily suggest something like that. He smiled and said that he had grown up and was attached to her. The young lady, in turn, was amazed and embarrassed as he said that he liked her. She was in shock as she realized that, unfortunately, she had lost her mind again. She knew that she had to calm down immediately and clarify all the details with him. Lifla blushed with embarrassment and asked in surprise what was the reason for his words. Eugene looked at her intently and asked if he wasn't allowed to do this. She understood perfectly well that if she said no, he would probably be upset. Lifla hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She froze when she saw his upset expression. She knew that she just couldn't resist such a cute face. Taken aback, the princess said that she was very grateful to him. A moment later, the knight's expression changed, and with a joyful smile, he said that he was very glad to hear it. The young lady was shocked, as she saw that he was simply beautiful. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that if he tied himself to her, he would not have much time. He said that he could serve for a certain period, since 1 year was no problem for him. But the young princess knew that this was a problem for her. since she planned to leave the palace in a few months. She was puzzled, because she knew that she couldn't leave the knight here. Because if this happened, then history would return to the original. She supposed that she could take the maid and the knight with her for protection, and then no one would be hurt for sure. The young lady looked at her knight with a joyful smile and said that she accepted his return with pleasure and asked him to take care of her. She looked away from him, embarrassed, and said that just recently she thought he looked embarrassed when he swore to protect her. The knight looked at the young princess with a smile and said that it didn't matter. A moment later, his smile disappeared as he heard the princess cough wildly. The princess, in turn, was furious. She did not understand why everything happened right now. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and told her knight that she would think about it when he returned back. Eugene was taken aback, because he knew that now it was not important. He wanted to call the doctor, but the princess refused him. Eugene was furious. He shouted at the princess that she was coughing up blood, and the doctor needed to examine her. Lifla sighed heavily and asked him to go back, since there was no reason to call a doctor. Eugene looked at the princess with fury. She sighed heavily and, drying herself, said that this happens all the time and it is not very serious. The young princess turned around with a smile and looked at the knight and asked if he could pretend he hadn't seen it. Eugene sighed heavily and said he understood everything and also asked if there was anything she needed. She sighed heavily and said she didn't need anything and she was fine. Sometime later, the princess was quietly hiding under the blanket. She sighed heavily because this time she did not hear the voice of the true owner of the body. The memories of when she was 4 years old passed quietly, but already 5 times she coughed up blood, not hearing the voice of the princess. She was puzzled because she really wanted to take a photo of the little princess, but unfortunately she couldn't do even that. However, she was happy with the memories she saw. The princess, who always looked like an ice statue, was running through a field of grass in your memories. A huge meadow in an unknown estate, but unfortunately, she never heard children's laughter. But the princess ran with great determination. The young lady rejoiced at such memories, for she knew that the princess really was like an angel. She understood that when she left the imperial palace, she would be allowed to take other people with her besides Eugene. She knew that she had to check everything carefully. Lifla didn't think that Cain was one of those people. Even if she wasn't sure about him, he was still a duke. She knew that the danger of dying at the hands of the crown prince was fairly small, but she still knew that there was a chance that he would fall in love with the main character, as was intended in the original. She sighed heavily, as she knew that she could do everything to prevent it from going that far. Lifla, I understood perfectly well that everything would be fine, until the young man heard those cherished words from the main character. However, she knew that there was nothing special in the main character's words. But when he first heard something like this, he felt a thrill. Then, the main character seemed to have carved out a place for herself in his heart. The princess understood that if she prevented this, he might become attracted to her for other reasons. But she understood that he would not fall in love with her as desperately as he had in the original. She understood that then the crown prince would not harm the duke so much. A moment later, the princess switched to the third minor male character, the insanely rich leader of the Harris Information Guild. She knew he was that ridiculous type of character who said he wanted to see Ariel cry. She sighed heavily, because she knew she didn't have to fight and take him on. He was cautious and took a different path than Eugene. He looked like a character who would never die, but in the end, he died saving the main character. As with Cain, if you reduce the number of encounters with Ariel, there will be a chance to save him. Besides, Harris and Daniel were close friends. She knew perfectly well that if she ever felt uneasy, she would just gently tip Daniel off and say that his friend could die if he spent time with the main character. She sighed heavily, as she knew that she was now left with Avon and Jane, who were both in love with the crown prince. But they left their love for the sake of their close friend, Lady Awen, who sacrificed everything to become better, and Jane, who drank deadly poison in place of the main character. The young princess was a little unsure of Avon, but she knew everything about Jane. She sighed heavily, because she knew that after Togo saved them, she had to go to the doctor. Now she understood that out of all the characters she remembered about, she only needed to take Eugene into her hands. A moment later, she lay down on her bed with a joyful smile, for she knew that her malaise should end tomorrow. She was already making a plan to help Eugene and Kane become closer to each other. Eugene sighed heavily as he looked at everyone present. His mood had changed greatly since he was first assigned as an escort knight. The young maid looked at the knight intently and asked if he was looking for her. Eugene sighed heavily and said that he was sure she was very busy, so he apologized for calling. She looked at him intently and said that it didn't matter, and also asked what surprised him so much. He sighed heavily and said that he was surprised by what happened in the palace. Eugene said he thought it was better to find out about it now before it all came back. Emma said she understood, but there was nothing he should worry about. Eugene looked at the maid intently, but did not answer. Emma sighed heavily and said as she walked that even if something had happened, she had no right to talk about it. Emma looked at him intently and said that as long as the princess trusted him as an accompanying knight, it was enough that he saw it with his own eyes. Emma looked closely at the knight and said with a gentle smile that she really hoped he would take good care of the princess. Eugene stared at the maid, because he just wanted to know how much she knew about the princess's situation, but she didn't share the information with him. He knew that she wouldn't do it so easily. He sighed heavily and looked at the departing maid with a smile, because he understood that she was the princess's personal maid. He understood that this was right, because it was her duty to be polite. But a moment later, he shuddered and darkened. He remembered the princess, who had recently coughed up blood. He understood that such a sharp, bloody cough was clearly not a good sign. He knew that when they used mana, the princess's condition was at its worst. He knew it didn't look like the pain she was used to, but the princess looked calm. He guessed the problem might be worse than just Raphael's illness. Eugene felt relieved when the princess took him back. He knew he needed to start working with the doctor as soon as possible. Whenever he thought about the princess, the first thing that came to his mind was that he had to protect her. With the speed of lightning, the young man burst into the doctor's office and called him. He understood perfectly well that he must do everything in his power to help the princess. Rox looked at the young man in surprise and said that he was just in time. Eugene sighed heavily. He knew perfectly well that no matter how he looked at all the people who were in the room, he understood that they were all united only because of the princess. He smiled and said that they looked like they were gathered for a private meeting. Eugene looked at the Duke and asked with a smile if he was still working with them. The Duke said that he was just taking advantage of his vacation. Eugene was surprised, because he did not expect to hear something like this. He asked the Duke in surprise if he really knew such words. Her genie was puzzled, for he knew that the Duke had only met the princess once that time. He wondered if the Duke was more importunate than he seemed. Eugene looked at the Duke intently. He wondered if he was any different from the current prince. He couldn't guess what he was really thinking. Rox looked at everyone present and said that they could start right now. And since everyone was here, there was no reason for them to delay, since they had several aspects to consider. He looked hard at everyone present and said he would like to consider a full recovery as well as the elimination of symptoms. He looked hard at the Duke and said he had said earlier that he had some ideas about this. The Duke said that was all correct. A moment later, he said that they could start with the main thing, since he could freely control mana through his body. Ripley looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he was really saying that he controlled the mana in his body. He asked if it was like holy power. The Duke said that it was true. Eugene, in turn, was truly amazed. Ripley said in surprise that it was a known fact that his mana was classified as light, and the Duke was now showing that his mana was dark. Eugene looked at the Duke intently and asked if he was proposing to mix his mana. He said that even if it was an impossible combination, they would get a unique synergy, and they might find a way to eliminate the symptoms earlier than they expected. At the same time, the young princess was sitting in her office and thinking about this situation. She was puzzled and worried, because she had not seen her handsome men for several days. She was puzzled because she did not know how to live on without meeting them. She was in shock, did not understand where they had gone after meeting her. She wondered if they really did not need her now. A moment later, she heard some noise behind the door and quietly looked out. Theo looked at the young maid in surprise and asked why she was making cookies for herself late at night. He looked at her closely and asked if she couldn't do it during the day. He was worried and asked what she would do if something happened. The young princess, in turn, was taken aback because she remembered that yesterday evening she had asked the maid how to bake cookies. She was puzzled because she realized that it was entirely her fault. Theo looked at the maid and said that Ernie would now take care of the princess's dishes for her. A moment later, the princess screamed. Theo looked away in surprise, as he did not understand who was screaming, but he froze and was taken aback when he saw the princess. Lifla ran hurriedly to the cook and shouted that she was very sorry, because last night she asked the maid to teach her how to make cookies in the kitchen. She looked at the chef sharply and said that she would be more careful in the future and apologized for disturbing him. Theo was taken aback and froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear something like that. He told the princess that she did not need to apologize and that nothing like that had happened. The young lady, in turn, knew that the best strategy was to attack. With the speed of lightning, the princess took her maid by the hand and ran away with her. Some time later, she sat quietly in the garden, puzzled by everything that was happening, as she could not find her boyfriends. A moment later, she turned around as she heard a painfully familiar voice. She froze for a moment as she saw her missing men. She was blinded by their radiance. The young princess was puzzled, because they were too beautiful and appeared suddenly. She was so enchanted that she was ready to faint. With the speed of lightning, Eugene ran to the princess and caught her. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was okay. Eugene looked at the princess worriedly and said that she should be more careful. The duke looked closely at the princess and asked excitedly if she was all right. Lifla, in turn, was taken aback and looked at the duke in surprise, but a moment later said that she was all right. She looked at the young people in surprise and asked why they were together. The duke looked at the princess intently and said that he had come to help her. He said that if she had some free time, they could talk. Lifla glanced sideways at the duke. She was puzzled, because everything was very strange. She had heard earlier that he refused to help her. She looked at the young man intently, because she thought he was a very cautious person. She looked at him, because she did not understand his expression. She looked away with a smile, as she saw that he was embarrassed. And Lifla, in turn, was surprised, as she didn't know about such a sweet side of him. She looked closely at the young people, as she saw that they had begun to work together. She was shocked by this fact, because she knew that under the pressure of the crown prince in the original, the young people opposed each other. It was very difficult for her to believe that they could interact because of her. Lifla looked closely at the duke and said with a smile that she had heard that he had decided to retire from business. The duke, in turn, said that it was so, but he also asked if it was really that important. The young lady froze for a moment in shock. She was surprised and amazed, because she knew that in the original, he took his first vacation because of the illness of the main character. She wondered if he really took a vacation now for her sake. She puzzledly said that there was nothing wrong with it. It was just unexpected for her. The duke, in turn, awkwardly looked away, as he was embarrassed. He sighed heavily and said that he knew it. She was surprised, did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that he had a reason for Togo to take a break, and she didn't need to look at him like that. Lifla was confused. She didn't know whether she should laugh or support him. But in turn, the young man could not resist and laughed wildly. They looked at Eugene in surprise, because they did not understand why he was laughing for no reason. The young princess looked at the knight in surprise and called him. The duke looked at the young man with puzzlement and asked if he thought it was too much. Eugene, bursting into laughter, told the duke that he looked like someone who was taking a vacation for the first time in his life. The young lady, in turn, sighed with relief, as she realized that their relationship was developing well, even without her intervention. She looked at the duke with a smile and said that she never said that he did not know the meaning of the word. He sheepishly said that it was so. She looked at the duke intently and said with a smile that it was just a joke. She asked if he had taken her words seriously. The duke was taken aback and said that he had not. She looked at them intently and asked about her, what they had done up to that moment. The duke said that they were researching how to change the course of her illness. She looked at them in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. She was surprised, because she understood that Eugene wanted to help her, but she did not understand why Cain did such a thing for her. The duke looked closely at the young princess and, holding out his hand to her, said that she should not worry, because the medicine he created had no side effects. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked why he wanted to help her so much, since they were almost strangers. He sighed heavily and said that that day, even in complete despair, she did not show her fear in any way. She looked at them in surprise and asked if she should be afraid of something. She wondered if he was talking about the time she first admired his beauty. The princess was a little puzzled, because she did not know why she should be afraid of him. The duke sighed heavily and said that if she had not been ill, she could have taken the throne. Eugene blocked the way, blocking the young princess with his body, and looked intently at the duke. He looked at the duke with fury. The young lady, in turn, froze in place in shock. She was shocked by this statement. She was confused because a minor male character was trying to kill her. She knew that if the wind carried these words to the prince, he would certainly hear them, and she would be immediately executed. She knew that this was simply madness, and she could not allow this to happen. She looked at the duke with cold fury and said that it was simply impossible. Eugene, in turn, froze in place. The young lady came up to the duke with lightning speed and said that she was very sorry, but she dreamed of living freely. She looked at him intently and said that, of course, she was immensely grateful for his help, but she had no desire to have what he was talking about. She said that now he had heard her desire, and he should understand that she was not interested in this status, and he should not even try to convince her otherwise. The duke sighed heavily, and looking at the princess, said that he understood perfectly well how she felt. Lifla looked closely at the duke, because she saw that he had not finished speaking. She was puzzled, because she did not know what else he wanted to say. He bowed and said that, in his eyes, she had more suitable characteristics for this status. Unlike the crown prince, Lifla froze for a moment in shock, because she did not expect to hear such a thing. Cain looked at the princess intently and said that if she did not want it, then his wish could not be fulfilled. He sighed heavily and said that he hoped she would find someone who would limit the actions of the crown prince. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot. She wondered if something like this had really happened in the original. She understood that something strange was definitely happening now. She was puzzled, because she knew she had to say something to interrupt him first. Looking away from the duke, she said that she would soon leave this place. Eugene looked hard at the young duke and told him to stop talking like that. The young lady froze for a moment, as she saw the atmosphere between the young people suddenly become tense. She looked at them with tears in her eyes, as she did not want anything like that at all. Cain bowed with lightning speed and asked for forgiveness for his momentary impulse. He wanted to apologize for his words. She smiled and accepted his apology. She sighed heavily as she knew that they could now clear the air. Lifla looked at them with a smile and asked if they could continue on their way. Lifla looked closely at the duke, for thanks to this dialogue, she had learned one thing of which she was now certain. She sighed heavily as she realized that the duke truly hated the crown prince. But unfortunately, the original story did not have time to show his true feelings. When they arrived at the doctor's office, the princess saw that her doctor was not alone, but with a man she did not know. A few minutes later, she met a young herbalist. In turn, the princess was puzzled, as he gave her a ton of medicines that she had to take without leaving them. For all the medicines, there were detailed instructions. Unfortunately, the young princess did not understand a single word, even when she tried to be his words. But nevertheless, she pretended that she understood everything. But a moment later, the inevitable happened, and she started coughing again. Everyone present looked at her in confusion. The princess was puzzled, because everything happened when memories suddenly came flooding back to her. Eugene rushed excitedly to the princess and asked if she was okay. With lightning speed, he offered her a handkerchief and began to court her. Lifla wondered what memory would come back this time. She sighed heavily as she realized that next time, she would have to carefully follow the schedule and not go outside for a while. She looked at everyone present with a gentle smile and said that he was completely fine now, so they didn't need to worry. She said that they could continue. Ripley looked at the princess in surprise and told his mentor that he didn't know she was such a fearless person. He whispered that he almost respected her for such bravery. The young lady, in turn, was embarrassed by such words and wanted to just throw his words out of her head, Ripley quietly said that she was an awfully wise person. She was shocked and wanted them to finish quickly so she could go back. She wanted to close her eyes and pray, to hear the beautiful voice of a real princess. Memories came flooding back to her, and she saw the maid saying that she had brought a gift from his lordship. The young lady knew that the gentle voice of young Emma was also beautiful. She saw the embarrassed young princess. Then she opened the letter, congratulating her on her birthday. The young lady saw the surname of the family to which the princess's mother belonged, but she was sure that they had stopped keeping in touch after her mother's death. She was surprised that they were still diminishing in letters. The princess, with a joyful smile, told her maid to bring the paper. The young lady looked at all the memories with a smile, as she was happy to see her idol's childhood. She felt the princess becoming happier in her memories. But after that day, even the brightly shining princess changed greatly. That day, she suddenly learned about the illness. Unfortunately, the young lady didn't know what happened, but she thought her heart would break if she saw the memories of that day. However, she didn't feel sorry for her. She knew perfectly well that if the princess she had recently met knew that she had dared to pity her, she would have gnashed her teeth. Looking at all the memories, she fell in love with the princess even more. Now she knew that the relationship between the Duke and her knight, who were enemies in the original, had become friendly. She knew that their relationship was developing well, and from that point of view, she shouldn't worry about it. Lifla was very happy, because she knew that this problem was solved, and she could do other things. She sighed heavily, as she knew that time was flying by quickly, and so she had to meet with the Duke as often as possible. She understood that he wanted her to become empress, but she was still worried about her life. She did not want to leave him unhappy. The next day, Eugene stood quietly outside the princess's room. Looking out the window, he noticed that it was a beautiful day. He sighed heavily and frowned, as he knew that while he was spending time with the prince and condemning the positive changes were happening very quickly. The young princess, in turn, abruptly opened the door and greeted her knight. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he wanted to go for a walk. He smiled and agreed with her. As they walked down the corridor, they discussed where they could go. Sometime later, they came to the library. She slowly and proudly gave the knight a pass and said with a smile that she was a very important person. Eugene looked at the princess with a smile and said that she was trying hard just to get in. The young princess looked at the young knight intently. She wondered if it was just her imagination or if he had become less reserved. She was shocked because he was looking at her intently and smiling, but at the same time he was behaving inappropriately towards her. But, unfortunately, the young princess could not tell him anything because he gave her his radiant smile every day. They wandered around the library for a while. The young lady was surprised and at the same time alarmed. She looked in every corner of the library, but unfortunately, she could not find the Duke. She wondered if he had returned to his office. She knew that if that were the case, it wouldn't be a break at all. A moment later, she looked at the half-open door in surprise. She froze for a moment as she saw the Duke hiding in a secret corner. She froze in shock as she fell in love with him once again. She was amazed by his beauty, because he was reading a book with concentration. Eugene looked at the princess in surprise and bewilderment as he saw the worried expression on her face. She turned around with lightning speed and told him to be quiet. With the speed of lightning, the young princess grabbed her knight by the jacket. He was surprised and did not understand where she was going, because she did not even call the Duke. She smiled and, as she left, said that she felt she should not interfere. Lifla turned around with a smile and looked at the knight and asked if now was not the time for a break. She said that this was the time when a person had the right to spend time as they wished, so she thought that she should not interfere with something like that. The young lady, in turn, was alarmed, for she knew the Duke was very sweet, and she did not wish to ruin such a scene. Eugene looked closely at the young, beautiful princess with an admiring smile. He smiled and extended his hand to her, saying that they could go for a nice walk together. Lifla froze for a moment as she saw a warm smile. She never thought that something like this could happen in the original story. Now that she thought that he was gradually getting rid of his role as a shield for the main character, Lifla said with a smile that it sounded very good and they could go for a walk. A moment later, she turned around as she heard the Duke's voice. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't expect to see him so quickly. The princess looked at the Duke with a smile and asked what brought him here. He sighed heavily and looked away, and with pity in his voice, he said that she just left. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he knew that they were there. Lifla looked at the Duke with a radiant smile and said that he was on a long break, and she thought he would want to enjoy the fresh air together. She asked with a smile if it was him who was tense. The Duke, in turn, looked away, embarrassed and awkward, and said that it didn't bother him at all. The young princess looked at the Duke with a smile and said that on such days one should leave the palace more often. Lifla looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if he wanted to go on a short walk with her and Eugene, as she wanted him to enjoy the rest as well. The Duke looked at her closely and agreed. After a short conversation, the young princess went for a walk with Eugene and Kane. They strolled leisurely in the garden. Lifla assumed that the Duke would sit down next to them and rest with them, but unfortunately, the Duke refused them, citing the fact that it was indecent. However, she felt relieved to see that he was watching them. She knew very well how he showed his emotions. In the original story, Eugene called the Duke treacherous and hated him, but now he looked in fascination at how the Duke was having fun. Lifla looked closely at her knight and said with a smile that today was a lot of fun. She said that he looked very friendly. Eugene looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really talking about the Duke now. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that. Eugene looked at the princess intently and said that no one would give the Duke such a description. She smiled and said that it seemed so. She looked closely at the young knight and said with a smile that the Duke was still very kind. Eugene, in turn, looked with a smile at the princess. Divine later said that she was still very strange. Compared to the clear weather, the rumors that spread through the palace were gloomy. Everyone said that the princess was dying, and the emperor still wanted to expel her. Words were said that should not have been spoken. The maid understood perfectly well that these rumors should never reach the princess's ears. Aaron looked at the princess closely and asked with a smile if she would like to drink some warm tea before going to bed. Lifla thanked the maid for her concern. Lifla looked at the maid with a smile and said that she had worked hard today, and now she should have a good rest. Aaron looked at the princess with embarrassment and agreed with her. Since the palace was currently in a state of unrest, Aaron kept thinking about what to do if strange rumors did reach the princess, and she, in turn, wondered if the princess would be okay. Lifla stared into the distance. She knew that this was indeed reality, but it seemed to her as if she was in a dream. She sighed heavily and said quietly that if this wasn't a dream, then she didn't want to wake up. Linny looked at the princess with tears in her eyes. She didn't understand what she was talking about so suddenly. She wondered if the princess already knew about the rumors, and she felt worse. She looked at the princess with tears in her eyes because she didn't want her to bear the burden alone. A moment later, the princess quietly said that she might have to leave, leaving something behind. The maids froze in place for a moment. Lifla was glad that she could spend the whole day with the men. She knew that they were more beautiful than flowers, but still she was sad that she couldn't even take a photo of them. She sighed heavily, knowing that she would unfortunately not be able to take a photo, but a moment later, she quietly said that she had to keep a diary. The young princess turned around as she wanted to call her maid, but noticed that there was no one in her room. The maids rushed to the head maid with tears in their eyes. They said that the princess wanted to leave and leave behind only a diary. Linny was puzzled, because she did not understand why the princess suddenly wanted to keep a diary. She knew that the princess had never done anything like this before. Erin sighed and said that she didn't want to worry for no reason like her friend. But she clearly heard the princess's words. Emma looked closely at the young maids and said that they needed to calm down for now. But in turn, she was also excited, as she did not understand why the princess suddenly wanted to keep a diary. She was scared and wondered if the rumors about the princess's death could be true. Emma wondered if the princess really wanted to leave the palace and give up her right to the throne. Where misfortune befell a high-ranking person, the servants rarely suffered so much. However, after the princess opened her heart and became closer to them, she became a special person to the palace servants. Emma knew perfectly well that if this was all they could do for the princess, they must help her. She looked at the young ladies and said that she must get everything ready so that they could go back. Lifla looked into the distance. She was happy, because today she could see the memories of the young princess. She knew that at a young age the princess already loved to study. She watched the young princess with admiration, as she was very elegant at her young age. She sighed heavily and stretched slowly, as, unfortunately, after such good knowledge, she could fall asleep, and therefore decided to take a short walk in the garden. The young lady looked around with a smile on her face as she saw that this place was beautiful at night. She realized that she needed to come to the fountain more often. She sighed heavily as she realized that almost a month had passed since she had arrived at the palace. She was puzzled because she couldn't even leave the palace, but in turn, she noticed that time really flew by. Lifla understood that she had to prepare in order to leave the palace. She wanted to meet the other heroes outside the palace walls. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that her doctor would not allow her to do this. She was puzzled because the doctor was overreacting to her requests. She really wanted to cry and scream that she wanted to get out. But unfortunately, her thoughts flew away when she heard a crunch not far from her. She turned around and saw the Duke making his way through the bushes. She looked at the Duke in surprise, as she had not expected to see him at such a late hour. The Duke, in turn, bowed low to the princess. She looked at the Duke intently, as she understood that he was a man of several of their words. Lifla, looking at the Duke, said that she did not at all think that she would meet him in such a place. She looked at the Duke sharply, knowing he might call it indecent. She slowly approached him, and he called her in surprise. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because he again looked at her affectionately and called her. She understood that although he was an awfully quiet person, he was still very handsome. Lifla knew that everything would be fine if she started the dialogue first. She slowly walked up to the Duke and greeted him with a smile. The young lady was lost in her memories and decided to look at the Duke from the original story. He met the main character on his way when he was going to report on the case. He was an absolute workaholic and therefore rarely went outside. The young lady in turn was upset and cried because she cut her finger on the paper, while the young lady reading the lines of the novel laughed at how ridiculous it was. In any case, the young man couldn't just ignore the main character. He was always a long-term person, although if you look at him now, he looked very innocent. He carried darkness in his heart since birth, because in fact the Duke was partly a vampire. Perhaps that was the reason he was in a depressed state. Probably his end, which he did not want, was dark. The young lady, in turn, was furious because she realized that it was unfair that a handsome man should die young. She knew that it was because the Duke's past was depressive and dark. She was worried because she was worried that the prince might hurt the Duke like in the original. After she left the palace, his gentle nature worried her. Lifla looked at the Duke intently and said that he must survive and must not let anyone hurt him no matter what. She looked at him intently and asked if he understood her. She understood perfectly well that if someone with such beauty was hurt, her heart would also suffer. She was afraid to see the young man in a drunken state, but for a moment, thinking, she realized that everything would be okay if someone hurt him a little. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. The young lady was taken aback, and looking away from the Duke, said that she had not meant anything like that. She was puzzled as she understood that he was now standing in front of her, and she was fantasizing about him. She smiled and said she just wanted him to be okay as long as he was with her. She wanted very much for him to remain safe and sound, so that she could heal herself with his beauty in days of disappointment. Cain looked at the princess intently and asked if she would mind if he told her a story from the past. The princess looked at him tenderly and agreed to listen to his story. One day, a child was born, whose birth no one expected. Unfortunately, the child grew up alone. No one around him helped him. Since he was often alone, he had no friends. For him, the warmth of another person was a luxury he had never felt before. But one day, the child met a friend, and for the first time, he learned to enjoy the company of other people. He experienced warmth for the first time. Cain became even more attached to that person. One day, a friend told a child that while he would be his friend as he wanted, he must give him his blood, flesh, and heart. The child happily agreed, because it was the request of his first and only friend, and only in the distant future did the child realize that his friend had manipulated him. The Duke looked at the princess intently and asked what she thought about it. The princess looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She, unfortunately, was not sure who exactly the story was about, so she wanted to give him a safe answer. She looked closely at the Duke and said that she thought the child must run away. She looked at him intently and said that he should run without looking back before they took anything more than his blood, flesh, and heart. She sighed heavily and said that in fact he should not have given them up at all. The Duke looked at the young princess in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him intently and said that a true friend would never ask for such things. The Duke froze in surprise for a moment. A moment later, the Duke looked closely at the young princess and said that he and Eugene would accompany her tomorrow. Lifla looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, the Duke bowed low to the princess and said that no matter what happened, they would fulfill everything the princess wished for. Lifla froze in surprise and shock. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled. She didn't know what he was talking about. She wondered if he was talking about how no one would get hurt or die in the future. The lady really wanted him to control the outcome of events in the future. The Duke sighed heavily and said goodbye to her one last time. Lifla, in turn, looked intently after the Duke. She smiled a bright smile, because she didn't really know what happened between them, but she felt like he was being attentive to her, and for that reason, she liked him very much. The next day, after Cain and Eugene's persuasion, Rox and Ripley surrendered. Only then did the young lady understand what the Duke had meant that time. The young lady, in turn, knew that after the rain, there was always a rainbow. She happily ran up to the doctor and thanked him. Rox froze in embarrassment, but still, with tears in his eyes, he asked her to be careful. The young princess looked at the young people with a sly smile, as she understood that she could use this chance to hug them. With the speed of lightning, she ran up to them and hugged them tightly. The young men, in turn, froze in embarrassment as she squeezed them tighter. Eugene asked the princess with a grin if she was happy now. The young princess happily said that of course she was happy. She looked at them intently and asked with a smile if they would accompany her. The Duke smiled and said that it was true. Lifla looked at her maid with a smile and asked if she could prepare some ordinary men's clothes. A moment later, the maid presented the young men with the clothes that had been prepared in advance. Lifla looked at the young people with admiration, as they were beautiful. These clothes were more revealing than the old ones, and she liked it very much. Eugene looked at the princess and said that it was thoughtful of her. She looked at him contentedly, with a joyful smile. Eugene looked sideways at the Duke and said with a sly smile that with the Duke's help, they could do it. She smiled and said that it was exactly like that. Eugene looked closely at the princess and said with a satisfied smile that it was very good that the Duke had talked with the doctor and the herbalist yesterday. Cain, in turn, looked at his new friend and called him. Eugene smiled, looking at the Duke, and the princess stood in bewilderment. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was so tense. She was surprised, as she noticed that he smiled and became embarrassed. Lifla froze for a moment in shock. How very cute and handsome he was. A moment later, a wave of emotions washed over her, and the princess staggered. Everyone froze in shock as they saw that the Duke, who was always sullen, was smiling and embarrassed. She was shocked by his radiant smile, and her heart just couldn't take it. She staggered and everyone looked at her warily. Lifla was shocked by everything that was happening and understood that it was too much on his part. Unfortunately, she couldn't stand it and fell with a crash. But still, she was glad that she was able to see something like this. When she saw the Duke's smile, she decided to immediately deal with his problem, which she wanted to postpone. Now she realized that he opened his heart to her. Cain looked closely at the young princess and asked if she was okay. He was an outcast because of his bloodline, unable to protect those he cared about, starving for love. Letting people go so easily, he couldn't forgive himself for it. The more his self-hatred grew, the more he hated the prince. For someone like him, the princess was the best card to overthrow the prince. He understood that if he could use the princess, he would achieve the desired result. But he froze in place when he saw the look of the princess, who suddenly passed by him. Her look was unhappy and reminded him of the image of his mother, which he carefully wanted to forget. She reminded him and his mother, and it seemed to him that this was the real reason why he did not ignore or use her. However, in reality, the princess turned out to be a person beyond his imagination. Even with all his oratory skills, he couldn't describe it. But she was a person born from sunlight. As he looked at her smile in the moonlight, he felt his heart waver. The Duke looked at the princess from afar in surprise, as he did not understand why she had come out at such a late hour. He saw that she sighed heavily and said that she could not leave the palace. She understood that time really flew by very quickly. He was surprised and at the same time excited, because he did not understand why she had such a sad and exhausted face. The Duke looked closely at the princess, for he saw that she gave the impression of being a strong and bright personality, but unfortunately, he realized that there was no hope of curing her. He thought for a moment, as he had heard earlier, that she wanted to visit the market, but because it was located on a noisy, crowded street, the doctor was against her visiting. He knew that only Eugene listened to the princess and asked the doctor for permission so that the princess could visit the noisy street. He sighed heavily, as he knew that only a few people knew about the princess's true situation. He knew perfectly well that no matter how he saw the situation, he knew that the market was dangerous for her. The Duke slowly approached the princess. She in turn greeted him with a gentle smile. He froze, as he did not expect such a thing. Then she told him that he must survive and should not allow the outsiders to harm him. The Duke was confused, as he did not understand what she meant. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she didn't mean anything serious. She just wanted him to be okay as long as he was with her. At that moment, he clearly saw how the princess's smile weakened. He knew it was a very strange request. He had never been wounded. He had never worried about getting wounded or dying. The Duke sighed heavily, as he realized that these were too harsh words for him. Because of such kindness that entered his heart, he told her about the hatred that had been hidden in his heart for a very long time. He knew it was an impulsive question on his part, and he deliberately wanted to cut off all ties with her because she had gotten too close to him. Then the princess told him that the child had to run away. The princess also told the Duke that a true friend would never ask for such things. He knew that her words were true. A moment later, the Duke bowed to the princess and told her that he would be by her side. And no matter what happened in the future, thanks to her warm and pure words, the wall around his heart collapsed in an instant, and he then decided that he would remain by her side until her last breath. The young lady looked into the distance with a bright smile. Because she was determined to push the Duke, she really wanted to tear down all the unnecessary flags. She really hoped that, with her help, he would stop and not give his life for the main character. Of course, there was another reason: her walks in the middle of the night. She knew that today was the day when she would start coughing, but in turn, she was not upset, because she knew that she would get new memories. Lifla sighed heavily and looked around, as she knew that the Duke came to hone his skills around this time. She looked into the distance, for she knew that he was a knight, like Eugene. The young princess wandered around the area with a joyful smile, enjoying the fresh air. The morning walk had lifted her spirits, but for a moment she froze, as it seemed to her that someone had shouted after her. Looking around, she saw no one, and thought that she had only imagined it. But a moment later, she froze in place, as she saw the Duke himself. She was glad that she found him so quickly. The Duke looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not expect to see her at all. He excitedly came closer to her and asked if she had come alone. The young princess looked at the Duke with a smile and said that it was true, but she didn't even think that he would be here. Lifla looked at the Duke intently and asked if she had disturbed him. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a smile that it was not so. A moment later, he said that she should wait for him a little while. The Duke slowly walked towards his things. A moment later, the Duke, asking for forgiveness, covered the young princess with his cloak. The young lady froze for a moment in embarrassment. She looked at the Duke with embarrassment, as she was very surprised by his action, but still thanked him. He looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, it was already late and therefore cold. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she wasn't sleeping at such a time. Lifla looked at the Duke with a joyful smile and said that she just wanted to meet him. But a moment later, she was taken aback and said that she had had a nightmare, and that was why she couldn't sleep. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady smiled tenderly and sighed heavily, saying that on such days she often had nightmares. She smiled and asked why he was here now. She sighed heavily and said that if her question made him uncomfortable, he didn't have to answer. But the Duke looked calmly at the princess and said that he was just training. The young lady, in turn, came in the middle of the night to taste on this topic. She had the feeling that she was playing a game and knew the answer in advance, but, unfortunately, she had a bad feeling. Looking away from the Duke, she said that she had distracted him after all. The Duke sighed heavily and said with a gentle smile that it didn't matter, because he was training his heart, not his sword. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew what the main character would have answered in her place, but she in turn said that she understood him. She smiled and said that it seemed that if he trained, his mind would become stronger. So he sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he did not know this. The mood was slowly changing, but her heart was beating very hard, and she was starting to go crazy because his voice was deep and charming. The young lady was simply drunk on it. She sighed heavily, as she knew that, unfortunately, she couldn't leave things like that. She knew that the trauma was poisoning his heart, and there was nothing better than a few phrases. Besides, the young lady knew the magic words very well. They should make him feel much more comfortable. Lifla sighed heavily, and, without looking up, said that she knew perfectly well that this was a very stupid question. But since it was not something he could see or feel, he was unable to draw accurate conclusions. She looked at the young man intently and asked if there was something bothering him since he was training. Cain looked away from her as he hesitated to answer. A moment later, he said that it was not a problem that the princess needed to worry about. Lifla sighed heavily and said that she didn't want to interfere. But still, if his heart was breaking, he should give his mind a little rest. She looked at him intently and with a gentle smile said that this was exactly what she was thinking. The Duke froze for a moment in place, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Lifla knew very well that these words were originally spoken by the main character, after she followed the Duke and learned of his heavy burden. Of course, she couldn't know about his thoughts. She just answered that way when she heard that he was solving some problems. But she knew perfectly well that these words were very important for the young Duke. Unfortunately, Cain was someone who lost a lot at a young age because of his magical powers, and ended up being used and thrown away like an object. Lifla looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he should rest. She smiled tenderly and said she always wanted to tell him such words. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking away from her, asked what she knew about him. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a question. She sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, she did not know anything. She came closer to him and, reaching out to his face, looking into his eyes, said that she knew nothing about him. The young princess gently stroked the Duke's head and said that knowledge and the ability to feel do not always go hand in hand. Cain froze in surprise and shock. In turn, the young lady really wanted to pet her favorite character on the head, for which he would not be a puppy left in the rain. She's not actually able to pet him while standing on tiptoe, but it was enough to satisfy her devoted fans. She looked at him intently as she just wanted to play with him a little, but she was taken aback when she saw the Duke's reaction. With lightning speed, the young princess hid her hand behind her back and sighed heavily as she realized that she had overdone it again. She looked at the Duke, puzzled, as she really hoped that nothing had spoiled their relationship. A moment later, she timidly said that it was time for her to go back. As she left, she smiled and told the Duke that it had already become very cold and that he should also return quickly. Lifla, in turn, did not think that with these actions she could put the Duke in an awkward position. The young lady in turn understood that if he heard the words spoken, the main character now, he would not behave as if he had met his savior. The young man froze for a moment. He understood that it was simply impossible that the princess knew what pain he had experienced, because even the emperor himself had not known anything like it. He was taken aback and wondered what if she knew about everything. He saw that she was smiling kindly, as if everything was okay, but he didn't understand why her words penetrated so deeply into his heart. He wondered if it was because she was the one who said them. In turn, Eugene watched the young people closely. Because he was interested in what they were doing at this time, he saw that the Duke was shocked. As he thought, the princess wanted to be alone. He watched the princess quietly and made sure that she did not notice him. But he was surprised when she quickly found the place where the Duke trained. Then he shouted that she should stop because he was excited. But the princess did not hear him. A moment later, Eugene jumped down from the tree and, looking at the Duke, said that, apart from the nightmares, the princess's condition was not improving. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he had seen. Eugene looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked if it was really that important. Cain looked at his new friend but said nothing. Eugene looked at him and said that he reported it because he was too busy talking to notice. Eugene asked the Duke if he knew about the rumors that were quickly spreading in the palace and beyond about the princess. He said that everyone was saying that the princess was close to death. The Duke was shocked and at the same time excited by these rumors. Eugene looked at the Duke and said that the princess was not just having nightmares. The Duke was taken aback for a moment and wondered if the princess had ever been this sad before. He sighed heavily as he realized that the princess was able to understand him because the princess acted as if pain was a natural part of life that she was used to. Eugene looked at the Duke intently and said that the princess always smiled as if everything was fine, but the situation could be much worse than they thought. Cain sighed heavily but said nothing. Now he realized that he had been too self-confident. Linny looked at the princess with a happy smile and said that there were many types of peasant clothing. For some time, she showed the princess different outfits without stopping. The princess looked at the maid with a smile because she thought that she was behaving very nicely. Lifla looked at the maid with a gentle smile and asked if she could pick out something that would look better on her. The maid looked at the young princess with sparkling eyes and said that she looked beautiful in any clothes she wore. Lifla looked at the maid with a satisfied smile, as she knew that this was the pure truth. The reason they were so busy now was because they were going to meet Miss Avon. The young princess, in turn, trusted her faithful maids regarding this problem. Lifla looked at Emma and asked if everything was ready. Emma smiled and said that everything was ready. Emma looked at the young princess with excitement and asked if she could ask why the princess was doing all this. Lifla sighed heavily and looked closely at everyone present, as she saw that they were very curious. She looked at them with a smile and said, "She fell asleep. There was no point in you having them." The business she entrusted to them concerned the closing of the salons that the princess owned. She knew perfectly well that they would all turn into paper when the original story began, because they would all go broke. She knew that salons were now very popular among the capital's ladies, but at the same time, she knew that the salon in the alley, which the main character would accidentally discover, would become incredibly popular. As soon as this salon began to open stores, all the others would go bankrupt. Now she understood that there was no point in having so many salons. Besides, the young ladies understood that it was better for her to have gold with her now. She knew that she needed resources to help Avon and her carefree future. She understood perfectly well that apart from money, there was nothing more attractive in the whole world. The young princess looked closely at her maids and said with a gentle smile that there was no point in her keeping salons. A moment later, she looked at them in surprise, not understanding why their faces had suddenly darkened. The maids were taken aback and said that they hadn't meant anything like that and that she didn't need to worry about it. The princess, in turn, looked at them in bewilderment but said nothing. She smiled tenderly because she knew that nothing terrible had happened. The princess decided not to worry because she knew that today was a very important day for her because she had prepared very diligently for it. Opening the door, she froze in place as she saw young people who were shining with their beauty. They looked at the princess with a gaze and said with a smile that she should follow them. Deep inside, the princess screamed, for they were simply gods incarnate. With a joyful smile, she approached the young people and told them that it was time for them to go. She smiled and looked at her maid with a puzzled expression. Lifla asked the maid for forgiveness, because next time she wanted to go for a walk in the city with her. A person of noble origin, an inconspicuous squirrel, the main character, who shed many tears and smiled constantly. She didn't know anyone from the imperial family when she visited the market for the first time, but she managed to attract the attention of the Information Guildmaster and the Mercenary Guild. Lifla sighed heavily as she knew that the female lead had also attracted Avon and Jane, who were also important characters. Lifla was puzzled as she realized that the female lead had gathered all the important characters around her. The young lady understood that the author was most likely just lazy and decided not to create a variety of locations for the novel. Eugene looked at the princess with alarm and called her. Lifla stared into the distance, lost in her thoughts, because she knew that her workload had decreased, because she didn't have to walk much due to the author's laziness. She knew that this place was truly a gold mine, because there was a market right across from the imperial palace. Eugene looked closely at the princess and said that she should not leave them, not even a step. Lifla smiled at her defenders and said that she would not do this. She knew that now she had to transfer the contract of sale to the new owners of the salons. Sometime later, she quietly entered the guild, but noticed that the man was sleeping quietly at his workstation. The young princess slammed her documents down on the table, and the man was taken aback and shuddered in shock. She looked at the man intently and said that she wanted to be paid in gold and jewels, so he should sort everything out quickly. The man was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. He hoped that he was not being humiliated now, but in turn, he was trembling with fear in front of the princess. She sighed heavily as she understood that she could not be kind when it came to important issues. Lifla looked at the man intently and said that in that case she would hand him the documents. The man, in turn, looked at the princess in surprise. He noticed a ring on her hand, which proved her identity as a princess. With lightning speed, the man set to work. The princess looked at him intently and asked if he knew about a place called the Black Grotto. At the same time, the young people sat quietly and waited for the princess outside the door. The princess walked out slowly and asked with a smile how long they had been waiting for her. Eugene rushed to the princess with lightning speed and called her. He looked at her with concern and asked if there was any problem. She looked at him with confusion, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that she had come here in person, and she could have caught unkind looks. He sighed heavily and asked if she had heard about the rumors. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Eugene sighed heavily and said with a gentle smile that he didn't mean to say anything like that, and if there were no problems here, then everything was fine and they could leave. Some time later, the young princess and her companions were walking along a busy street in which there was hustle and bustle. The Duke looked at the princess intently and asked with a smile if there were any other places she wished to visit. She smiled, for she saw that he was very kind to her. She looked at them intently and said with a smile that they should call her by her name instead of princess. The young people froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear anything like this. The Duke was taken aback, as he was puzzled by such a request. Eugene, in turn, bowed low and told the princess that if she wished it, he would be happy to fulfill it. The princess smiled and told the Duke that he could not worry and do everything as her knight did. Cain looked away from the princess in embarrassment and, asking for forgiveness, called her by name. The young princess, in turn, was struck right in the heart. Eugene looked at the princess with a happy smile and asked where else she would like to go. The young lady, in turn, knew that it was very beautiful, and she did not suspect that she would die exactly like this. She knew that she needed to calm down as quickly as possible, because her nose could start bleeding at any moment because of such emotions. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said with a happy smile that she would like to go to a place called the Moon Garden. Eugene looked closely at the young princess and said that she did not look well, and if she was not greeted, they could go there tomorrow. Cain was worried, as he knew that the Moon Garden was a pub. Elena, the princess of the area, said that she was fine, and they could go there. She knew that she was more than fine now, and in fact, now she did not even belong to the emperor, because she was soon to receive money from the sale of the salons, and now she would not be financially dependent on the emperor. She smiled and said that she really wanted to go there. Some time later, they visited a pub. The Duke looked at the princess with alarm and asked why she wanted to go there. The young princess hesitated, not knowing what to answer. She saw that they were watching her intently. She awkwardly looked away from them and said that she would like to try alcoholic drinks. In the original novel, she read that the alcohol in this pub was very tasty. The young people looked at the princess in surprise, as they did not expect to hear something like this. Eugene looked at the princess with a smile and said that he understood her perfectly. He smiled and offered her to drink quickly. The young lady, in turn, looked closely at the menu. She really wanted to try the popular moon drink, but in turn, she knew that she should not get drunk, so she wanted to drink one glass. Lifla walked up to the bartender with lightning speed and placed an order. At the same time, the young people were sitting quietly at the table. Kane sighed heavily and whispered to his companion that ordinary people would not recognize the princess, but perhaps ordering in person would be a bit of a problem for her. Eugene smiled and said that the princess looked very excited. He sighed heavily and said that it was the first time she had stepped outside the castle. He knew that her condition could suddenly worsen. She could not go out, because she could not be sure that she would be able to maintain the appearance of good health, although she really liked it. He remembered the maid, who had told him, alarmed, that the amount of blood the princess was coughing up had increased. Kane looked intently at his companion and whispered, "For this reason, those who spread all the rumors throughout the palace must not reach the princess's ears." The princess looked at her companions with a joyful smile and asked them for help, since she could not carry all the drinks herself. Lifla looked at the filled glass with a happy smile, as she could smell the bittersweet aroma of the drink. She was glad that she could drink some alcohol, as she hadn't had it for a long time. Eugene looked at the princess with a gentle smile and said that her hood had slipped a little. A moment later, he threw the hood over her head. Lifla screamed and called her knight. She smiled as he was very attentive to her. Eugene looked at her intently and said with a smile that she should call him by his name, so that there would be no misunderstanding. The young lady in turn was surprised and at the same time embarrassed. He looked at her with a tender smile and asked her to call him Eugene. The Duke, in turn, looked away from the princess and said that if it was okay, then she could call him by his name as well. The young princess froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, but she was still very happy. A moment later, Lifla was sitting quietly in her place, bursting into tears. She burst into tears and said with a smile that she would call them by name, and also thanked them. She was puzzled because she was very touched by their concern, and her tears flowed by themselves. Unfortunately, the princess was not allowed to make friends. She could neither understand nor dream of such things. Eugene looked closely at the princess and called her. But suddenly, they heard a conversation at the next table. The men were talking about a member of the imperial family dying. The man told his friend that he was absolutely sure that he heard everything clearly, because one of his acquaintances worked in the castle. He told him that the cruel princess was dying. Lifla sighed heavily, as the men had ruined her good mood with their conversation. The man told his friend that the princess was vomiting blood. The young men looked at the men with fury, but unfortunately, his friend did not believe his words, and did not understand where they got such information from. Lifla looked askance at the men. She wondered if the spread of these rumors was the crown prince's intrigue. She was puzzled, because the rumors had already spread among the population. The men, in turn, discussed this topic as they heard that the princess was slowly dying. The man looked at his friend and asked if he knew Annie, because it was she who told him about the princess. And it was not from just anywhere, but from the palace itself. The man, drinking alcohol, said that if the information was from the palace itself, then it seemed to be true. He sighed heavily and said that if this was so, then this was the best thing that could happen. Lifla froze in shock, as she didn't expect to hear something like that. They were saying that no one liked the princess anyway, and she should have died sooner. The young lady was furious. She didn't understand how they could insult the princess she loved so much. The Duke covered the princess's ears with lightning speed. She froze for a moment, as she heard some kind of rumble. She looked up and stared at the Duke, who was looking at her with a gentle smile. Kane looked at her intently, and with a gentle smile, said that it was already getting dark, and it was time for them to go back. Lifla sat as if spellbound, while the carnage raged behind her. A moment later, they nevertheless hurried towards the exit. The young man looked at the young people with a grin, as he was surprised to see such a strange company. He smiled and said to himself that it looked like the rumors were true. He was taken aback for a moment, because he saw that the princess had heard someone wishing her death, but she smiled as if nothing had happened. Harris was confused because he realized that the princess was very brave, but he still wanted very much to see her tears. The young man looked at his companion in surprise and asked how he could wish for such a thing. Harris looked at the young man with cold fury and anger and asked if he hadn't told him not to appear on his territory. The young man looked at his friend with a grin and told him to be kinder to his old friend. Harris looked intently at Daniel and said that he was very funny. Daniel sighed heavily and told his friend that he was only saying that because he cared about him, because people might think that he was a pervert who liked to watch other people cry. Harris looked at him intently and told him to look at himself, since the number of his mistresses was growing in proportion to the number of corpses he had a hand in killing. Daniel sighed heavily and said that this was a misunderstanding. Harris looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Daniel, in turn, quietly muttered that he had never had mistresses, because he did not understand why he would fall in love with his own target. Harris mockingly told his friend that he was simply crazy. He laughed wildly and said that if you think about it, it was very funny. Daniel looked at the door, curious to see if there was any reason to love the one who would soon die. Cain covered the princess's ears so that she could not hear everything that was happening behind her back, as Eugene dealt with his men with lightning speed. It was a one-sided fight for the night. She was alarmed because she was afraid that he might get hurt in the fight, but still she was grateful to him, because at that moment she saw how he was breathing raggedly, like a wild animal. She was embarrassed at the same time as he was insanely sexy then. Thinking about this, she was no longer angry at the men who wanted her dead, but she still wondered if her knight was angry because they insulted her. She looked at her companions with a smile and thanked them, for she was now happy. After her words, Eugene did not say a word. Lifla wondered if she had done something wrong. She approached Eugene and said, worried, that he had been silent the whole way. Lifla asked him if she had done something wrong. Eugene turned to the princess and quietly asked why she wasn't angry. She looked at him in surprise and, sighing heavily, said that she had no reason to be angry. Eugene was puzzled. He asked if what had happened wasn't enough. He didn't understand why she said there was no reason to be angry. Lifla sighed heavily and said that it wasn't that important at all. The knight froze in place in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She really liked the princess, and she knew that the princess was the villain in the original, so the princess couldn't fix the mistakes of the real story. So even if it was unpleasant for her to hear this, there was nothing in it that could make her angry. She didn't even want to ignore the life that the princess had lived up until now. Lifla looked at her companions with a gentle smile and quietly said that she didn't want to ignore the life that Uni had lived until now, and she didn't see anything wrong with such talk. She understood perfectly well that it was simply impossible to get rid of all the rumors. The only thing she could change was the mood of the rumors. Lifla didn't have any intention of worrying about such things at all. For now, her current body was weak, after all. She might get sick again if she took everything to heart. She smiled and told her companion that everything was fine, and he didn't need to worry. Eugene was furious. He shouted at the princess that she shouldn't take it lightly, even if it was always like that. She smiled and said that she was perfectly fine. He looked at her intently and shouted that it was not so, and he was perfectly aware of it. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he could not understand that she was happy enough now. Eugene sighed heavily and said that it wasn't that he couldn't understand it. Lifla sighed heavily as she understood that he had seen her carelessness more than anyone else, but she didn't understand why he was acting like that today. She wondered if he was drunk, and that was why his emotions were so strong today. She looked at him with admiration, as she realized that this was indeed a rare occurrence. Eugene sighed heavily, and looking at the princess, said that the doctor's panic was no reason to downplay the problem. He was alarmed and asked why she was not taking the prescribed medication. He was furious because she did not see slander for what it was, and did not understand why she was accustomed to such things. Eugene sighed heavily. He did not understand why she was so cruel to herself. Lifla was taken aback because she realized that the young man got drunk too quickly. They drank together because in the original, they were both resistant to alcohol, but she didn't think he would get drunk so quickly. Lifla looked at the knight closely and realized that she didn't need to let him drink like that anymore. Eugene looked at the princess intently and asked how she could smile knowing that she would soon die. While the Duke asked his friend to stop, Eugene sighed heavily and said, shaking, that he was just very upset. He was furious and did not understand why the princess made him feel this way. With the speed of lightning, he walked up to the princess and hugged her tightly. Lifla was taken aback by the embarrassment on the spot. Lifla was shocked by his actions and did not understand what he was doing at all. She was shocked, but knew she needed to calm down. But his scent was getting into her. She knew she needed to get distracted quickly, otherwise all the emotions would come over her. The young woman knew perfectly well that she could enjoy this moment. She wanted to reach out to him as his abs beckoned her. She was so happy that everything blurred before her eyes. A moment later, she looked at him intently and asked if he could hug her again. She sighed heavily and looked sideways at the night with tears in her eyes, because she knew that she simply could not say such a thing out loud. Eugene, in turn, sighed heavily and whispered to himself how he dared to do something like that. Lifla realized that he had already sobered up a little. He was puzzled, because he could not understand how he dared to cross the line and say such words to the princess. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so, because she had gone beyond the limits. She understood that she had hugged him, and thus gone beyond the limits of what was permitted. She looked closely at the young man and thanked him with a smile. A moment later, the princess froze in place as she saw what had accidentally opened his shirt. She realized that the best way out of the situation would be to fake fainting. At the same time, the Duke was closely watching the young people. But after a few seconds, he heard some kind of whistling in the distance. Looking around, he noticed that a stone filled with magic was flying towards the princess and Eugene. With lightning speed, he drew his sword from its sheath and repelled the attack. The stone quickly crumbled into small pieces. The Duke looked intently at his companion and said that he would leave the princess to him. At the same time, Harris stood around the corner of the house and watched the young people. He was irritated by the fact that they were clinging to the princess. He sighed heavily because he realized that he should not have left Daniel alone to spy on them. He understood that the harder it was to get close to her, the more he wanted to get her. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her doctor if he had any stimulants by any chance. She said that even if the effect was weaker, it would be better. He looked at her in bewilderment, not having time to say anything. She sighed heavily and said that she wanted something that she could get at any time. Rox was surprised. She sighed heavily and said that she fainted again yesterday. Lifla said that it began to happen more often. Rox looked at the young lady with a puzzled look. She looked at him sideways and said that she couldn't do this anymore. Rox looked at the princess with concern and said that fainting couldn't be prevented. He said that her weakening body was doing this in self-defense. She turned around and said with a smile that it wasn't that. She just wanted to prepare everything she could. She looked at the doctor intently and said in a puzzled tone that she had caused a lot of trouble for those around her yesterday. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. The princess began to speak, but suddenly turned around as she heard the door open. She froze for a moment when she saw her knight, with a puzzled expression on his face. She was shocked as she realized that he had heard their conversation. Unfortunately, yesterday she went crazy because she drank a lot for no reason. And while she pretended to faint, she actually fainted. She knew that Eugene was also drunk, so it was difficult for him to walk straight. She looked at Eugene intently, as she felt very sorry that he had ended up in such a situation because of her, while Eugene, in turn, looked at the princess intently with tears in his eyes. A few seconds later, he dropped to one knee with lightning speed, looked at her with alarm, and asked if he could find out what she meant by saying she was causing trouble. The young lady looked at her knight in confusion, wondering if he had asked her to list all her sins. She sighed heavily, as she had to tell him everything. Lifla sighed heavily and looked at her knight and said that she went where she wanted and made them drink too much. So because of her, they had to listen to terrible things about other people. He looked at her intently. The young lady averted her gaze from him, as she wanted him not to react so anxiously, which made it more difficult for her to continue her dialogue. She sighed heavily and said that when she fainted, she had caused a lot of trouble. With tears in his eyes, the young man asked the princess not to be like that. He didn't want her to do something like that to him. He sighed heavily and said that he was responsible for it, and she should not take his sins on herself. She froze for a moment in shock, as she did not understand what he was talking about. She was shocked and did not understand at all why he was crying. But she looked at him embarrassedly, knowing that he was handsome even with such a face. Lifla sighed heavily, as she knew that if this continued, she would faint again. With lightning speed, she reached out to her knight and asked with a smile why he was crying like she didn't want him to. Lifla smiled and said that she was very sorry, but everything would be okay now, so he shouldn't be sad. She smiled a gentle smile and told her knight that she liked him very much. Rox, in turn, watched the young men closely, as he was touched by their words. The young lady, in turn, looked at the knight with a tender smile, because she could not believe that she had just seen him crying. It seemed to her that holy water was flowing down his cheeks. He smiled and told the princess that he felt the same way. The oath of a free knight was different from that of ordinary knights, in that on the day his master breathed his last, he must let go of his sword. In fact, Eugene didn't really love his sword that much. He really didn't consider himself a knight. But one day, he wanted, never seeing the princess cry, and wished to stay with her for a long time. In reality, such emotions were similar to sympathy. He was surprised because he was very close to her. He knew that they were not friends or anything like that, but they had a special relationship. Eugene understood that this was enough for him. Late in the evening, he knelt before the princess and said that he dedicated himself to serving her. He wanted to become the sword and shield of this man until the very end. Smiling, he said that from this moment on, her beating heart, his life, was now hers. The Duke looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really taking an oath to a sleeping man. Eugene turned around and said with a smile that he had been thinking that if the princess found out, she would try to stop him. Eugene smiled and told the Duke that at first, he thought the princess was an ice statue, but then he realized that this did not match the rumors. Besides, he heard everyone say that the princess was cold and evil. It seemed to him that she was like an empty cup, made of ice that does not give, the cup that refused to feel emotion. However, one day the princess took the first step towards him, so he also approached her. Then he saw clearly that she was not made of ice. At that moment, Eugene felt a strange, did not feel, although he thought that he disliked her, since he had no other opinion about her. But he understood what this feeling was when he saw her real. Eugene looked closely at the sleeping princess and asked the Duke if he knew the princess. He smiled tenderly and said that she didn't let anyone get too close to her heart. In her first words addressed to him, he did not catch any hint of romantic interest. It was a feeling similar to a blooming spring field. He actually liked it. It was the first time he felt attention without romantic hints. Maybe that's why he gradually started to fall in love with the princess. However, he understood perfectly well that she had drawn a clear line between them. At that moment, he realized that, unfortunately, there was nothing he could do, but still, even then, he found her attractive. Eugene, for his part, could understand why she had drawn that line, but he still felt very sorry for her. Eugene knew that this was the reason why the princess never had her own people, which is why now he wanted to become the one who could take care of her. Looking at the Duke, he smiled and said that he wanted to tell about this oath a little later. Until the time came, he asked his friend not to tell the princess about this. He sighed heavily and said that with such a character, the princess would surely worry and feel guilty about it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was pure truth. Eugene thanked the Duke for his understanding. At the same time, the young man watched them closely. He was told that he should not harm this person, because her mother's family may seem indifferent, but this is not so in reality. Harris, feeling angry, told his companion not to interfere, as he was not at all concerned about such a thing, and he also told his companion that he was not the person to worry about her well-being. The young man told his friend that he had told him the gates, because he might get hurt. Harris irritably told his companion that if he continued to talk about it, he himself might get hurt. Harris was furious with his friend, but he couldn't say much against him. He sighed heavily because of the knightly oath, because the acquaintance was becoming more and more interesting. Today, the young lady had a dream where the princess was 8 years old. The princess sat quietly and slowly fingered the gift in her hands. It was still wrapped in a box. She looked at the princess in surprise, because she didn't understand why she still hadn't opened the door to him. A moment later, she turned around as she heard the maid calling the princess. Emma looked at the young princess with concern and asked if she had something important. The princess sighed heavily and told her maid that she would open the gift a little later. The young lady of the phosphate queue understood that the princess was afraid that the pleasant anticipation of the gift would disappear, so she took her time to enjoy it. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the princess, as the teacher wanted to hug her. She was puzzled, because everyone was treating the sweet princess very cruelly. She knew that if she had been there, everything would have been different. Some time later, the young lady woke up and shuddered as she tasted blood. She sighed heavily as she wanted to see more pleasant moments with the princess. She stretched slowly as she felt lightness in her body. This time, she fell asleep much earlier, as the doctor refused to give her stimulants, and instead, she took the stabilizing ones that he gave her earlier and quickly fell asleep. She looked intently into the mirror and thought for a moment, because she knew she had to go to the market to leave some traces, and she also knew she had to go to that bar again. She sighed heavily, as she was very worried about her knight, with whom they had recently had a very difficult situation. She sighed heavily. She knew that she would have to postpone the meeting with Haras a little, because she still had to get money for the salons that she had sold earlier. She wanted to quickly get the money and go look for Avon. Lady Avon, a charming creature, is the main character's friend, despite the fact that she loved the main character. The young lady sighed heavily, as she felt awkward about Avon hating the princess, but she knew that even if such original things didn't happen, everything was fine. Sometime later, the young lady, along with her maid and the knight, visited the market. Linny, in turn, was delighted by such a spectacle. The young maid happily looked at everything that came her way. She was puzzled and confused, but at the same time happy, because she did not know where she could go. The princess looked at the maid with a joyful smile, because she was very glad that she liked everything. The young lady knew that her maid came from a famous family, but when she was little, her family died in a heat wave. Soon after, she entered the palace. Perhaps because she lived and worked as a servant from a young age, she was not familiar with the outside world. The young lady looked closely at her maid, for she saw that she was as enchanted by her first walk as she had been. The young princess looked away in surprise, as she did not understand why so many people had gathered there. She froze for a moment as the young man sprinkled magic dust on the cotton candy and worked his magic. She was surprised because she saw regular cotton candy, but it was very shiny. Lifla was surprised that she could see cotton candy in this world. The young maid looked at the performance with admiration. A moment later, the young girls looked with admiration at the young man who was preparing cotton candy. Eugene looked at them intently, with a gentle smile on his face. With the speed of lightning, the princess grabbed her maid and said that they must quickly go and eat the cotton wool. The maid supported her in this. After some time, the princess's face changed, as she was very tired after such movements. She was too excited and played too much, so she was tired. The maid looked at the princess with tears in her eyes, because all this was because of her. Eugene looked at the princess intently and said that he would ask the doctor to give her some medicine to increase her stamina. Some time later, the princess clearly felt that Eugene's care had gone beyond all bounds. It seemed to her that the medicines she had received were not enough, and he brought her a very filling dinner. Unfortunately, the princess could not handle such a dinner on her own and asked her maid to eat with her. After eating and playing for several days, the memories of the 9-year-old princess returned. The young princess has become more mature over the past year. The young lady, in turn, felt alarmed when she saw that the princess began to look more like an ice statue. But she was still an innocent child who loved to learn and make origami. Maybe this hobby interested her because she couldn't go where she wanted. Lifla sighed as she understood that folding origami was still difficult, and, unfortunately, she couldn't do it like a real princess. Emma looked closely at the young princess and said with a smile that she had brought her the thing she had asked about earlier. Emma told the princess that if she touches the crystal, the diary will remember that she is its owner. She said that the diary has many functions, but it seems that there are also specific ones that only the owner knows about. Emma assured the princess that the diary had the highest level of security, Lifla was amazed, because she had not previously known about the existence of such an item. The maid smiled and told the princess that she had made sure that there were no dangerous features in it, so she need not worry about such things. Emma looked at the princess and called her. She smiled and told the princess that she was a very good person to her. Lifla froze for a moment in surprise and embarrassment. With the speed of lightning, she grabbed her maid by the hand and said with a smile that she was also a very good person, and for her, she was family. A moment later, the princess was taken aback and apologized for causing the maid inconvenience. Emma smiled and thanked the princess for such words, and she also said that she would always be by her side. Sometime later, the princess was staring at the diary as she had to touch the front to start writing in the diary. She slowly pressed the diary and looked at it intently. But a moment later, she heard some kind of ringing. The young lady jumped up with lightning speed and sat on the bed. She was worried, because she did not understand what had happened, because when she touched the stone to become the owner, it felt like she was diving head first underwater. Now I think about it, she remembered that this diary had other functions. It could track magic, repel magic, and it also had several levels of protection. They said that if you filled all the pages, you could meet the spirit of the diary. Also, if someone who is not the owner of the diary opens it, they will only see fake entries. She understood that if she could meet the spirit of the diary, then no one would be able to recognize the deception. The young lady was shocked that she could meet such a thing on her way. She was also told that the spirit could perfectly copy the owner's memory. She was amazed by the new gift and knew that she needed to make notes in it immediately. Sometime later, the young lady began to keep records in her diary, but she still wondered from which events exactly she should begin to keep records. Immersed in the letter, she did not hear how they were told by a stranger about them in his room. She didn't know if she was sleeping or if memories were flooding her. She didn't understand what exactly had changed, but unexpectedly for herself, she saw a beautiful and cute puppy. She thought that the princess had most likely received the puppy as a gift. A small gift that the princess received from her mother's family expanded the world of the young princess and turned it around. She previously thought that the princess was a child who loved to study, but it turned out that the reason for studying so hard was to receive a gift. The young lady, in turn, looked at the princess with admiration. The princess looked sideways at the man and asked why the puppy was in the room. The man sighed heavily and said that it was because it was a gift for her. The princess looked closely at the puppy and asked if the baby had no mother. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know this, and also asked for forgiveness, saying that it was time for him to leave. The young lady stared at the little puppy, who was shaking with fear. She looked closely at the puppy, and with a gentle smile said that from now on, her name would be Felia. It was her whistle, but no one had ever called her that. She sighed heavily and said that this nickname was very dear to her, and so she was giving it away. The young lady, in turn, opened her eyes as she smelled the medicine. She looked around vaguely and wondered if she was in the infirmary. A moment later, she slowly sat up, coughing, and noticed that there were courtship instruments near her bed. She realized that the base had fainted. She had never passed out from a memory before, but she knew that someone had definitely entered her room. Then she slowly turned around, because she heard someone's voice. Lifla sighed heavily, as she couldn't really remember what had happened. A moment later, she heard a conversation outside the door, the doctor saying that the princess's condition was not due to mental shock, because she had symptoms that resembled the destruction of her soul. He said that this disease affects the soul, and besides, the princess is weak and therefore susceptible to the most terrible side effects. He looked closely at the young people and sighed heavily as he said that the side effects continued to appear, and, unfortunately, her torment was intensifying. They did not know whether it was possible to replace her soul. He said that it would last no more than a few years. At the same time, the princess silently listened to the doctor's words. She knew that she was a real princess, had already replaced her soul, so these words did not apply to her, but she suddenly remembered how the princess looked with a smile at the puppy, who was dear to her. Unfortunately, the face of the young princess did not leave her head. What happened to her now meant nothing. Unlike the memories that returned to her, unable to bear it, she cried bitterly. She cried not because she could not hug the young princess then. The duke looked at everyone present and said that they should end the conversation, as he heard the princess crying in the next room. He looked at them intently and said that they should not talk about this here. Rox looked at everyone present intently. They said that they would return later, so the princess can rest now. The young princess, in turn, wondered how they knew that she wanted to be alone if they didn't even know that she was crying. A few minutes later, she looked up in surprise and saw a young man staring at her. Lifla looked at the young man with bewilderment, as she did not expect to see anyone. She looked at him intently, bursting into tears, and since it seemed to her that he looked like an angel, she sighed heavily and asked who he was. A moment later, memories came flooding back to her. She realized that it was he who had suddenly appeared in her room. It was he who had frightened her, and she had lost consciousness. She didn't understand who he really was. The young man looked at her intently and said that he was an angel. She looked at him puzzled, as she realized that he had a very high self-esteem. But in turn, the young princess only smiled. Of course, she thought that he looked like an angel, but she did not think that he would call himself an angel. But still, it was worth admitting to herself that she felt much better after his words. But, unfortunately, she didn't even really know who he really was. But unconsciously, she reached out to him. Lifla was surprised and at the same time puzzled as her hand moved on its own. She wanted to stop, but it was all in vain. At the same time, the young man quietly looked at the young princess. Because he didn't resist her, the princess felt like she was doing something bad. He looked at her intently and asked if she was not crying anymore. She smiled and said that everything was fine now. He looked at her in surprise and asked why. The young lady, in turn, knew perfectly well that she had to match the mood. She smiled a radiant smile and said that it was all because she had met an angel on her way. In turn, the young man looked coldly at the princess, but did not answer. Milady, in turn, looked awkwardly at the young man. She realized that she was too excited, but still she needed to stop. The young man approached the young princess with lightning speed and asked with a grin if she wanted to go somewhere with him. Lifla froze in place for a moment in embarrassment, but in turn, she would gladly go somewhere with him. A moment later, she turned around as she heard the voice of her knight. With the speed of lightning, the young man blocked the princess with his body. Eugene looked at the young man with fury. The young man smiled and said that his name was Harris. He looked at the princess with a grin and said that she should remember his name. With the speed of lightning, the young man disappeared. After his sudden disappearance, the princess froze in shock. Because she did not expect him to come to her, the Duke looked at the princess with concern and asked if she was okay. The Duke looked at the knight intently and told him to immediately set out in pursuit of the young man. And he also told the princess that she had nothing to worry about. Lifla thanked the Duke for his concern with a gentle smile. She knew that her knight most likely did not understand the young man, because he was simply an abnormal person. The princess looked at the Duke with a gaze and said with a smile that she was fine, and he could return to his place. Kane bowed and agreed with her. Harris, the leader of the Information Guild. In the original novel, he was known as a completely insane character. He had a truly angelic face, but in reality, he was a man with strange tastes. For example, he enjoyed seeing someone's crying face. He was a supporting character who always chased after the crying main character. At that time, he seemed like an ambiguous character who constantly helped the young heroine. And so he tormented the heroine, calling her crying face seductive. But in the end, he fell in love with their main character, like everyone else. But his ending was just as pathetic as the other characters. It all happened because you are the original new one. He died to save the main character. Before he died, he really wanted to see her cry for him, but Ariel, bursting into tears, begged him not to die. The young lady burst into tears and said that she was very afraid to be alone, but after these words, she continued to shout the name of the crown prince. Lifla thought about the original plot, and she felt like the female lead and the young man were meant for each other. But she knew that the ending was too pitiful for him, so she wanted to make sure that he didn't die this time. The young man, in turn, returned to his office and thought about the situation with the princess. He sighed heavily and thought, as he knew that her crying face was the best in his life. He remembered her beautiful, radiant smile when she said that her spirits had been lifted when she met an angel. He knew her face was beautiful and he could look at it for days. Then he smelled her tears. He felt the trembling in her hands, but still he liked her touch. The young man, in turn, was agitated, as the captain had disappeared without leaving a trace. Harris paid no attention to such words and ordered his subordinate to find out everything about the princess. The young man looked at the general in surprise and asked why he wanted to know about her. Harris sighed heavily and said that he was interested. The young man looked at him in surprise and asked if he was serious. Harris looked intently at the young man and asked a counter-question. The young man looked at his boss with a smile and said that it seemed like it was love at first sight. He could barely contain his laughter. Harris sighed heavily and told the young man to shut his mouth and do as he was told. Harris said that he must know everything about the princess, starting with her little habits. The young lady knew that she shouldn't faint because of the beautiful and handsome faces of the young men. She wanted to create a perfect plan, because if she switched her attention to something else, then perhaps she could reduce the chance of fainting. She smiled and asked the knight what his favorite color was. Eugene thought for a moment and said that he didn't know exactly what his favorite color was, but he often wore white. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and asked what about him. The Duke sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he didn't have a favorite color. Lifla thought about their styles for a moment. She saw that Eugene had beautiful silver hair, so white would suit him best. She knew that with sophisticated yet simple pieces, it would create the perfect style. Eugene looked at the young princess in surprise and asked if she had just spoken to him. She smiled and said sheepishly that it was true. Eugene smiled a gentle smile and said that this was something new, because he had often heard that only the most fashionable clothes suited him. She smiled and said she thought a sophisticated look would suit him best. She looked closely at the Duke and said that, on the contrary, fashionable clothes in dark colors would suit him. Lifla looked at the Duke with a smile and asked what they thought about going shopping together. The Duke looked away from the princess in embarrassment and said that if she wanted it, they could do it. Lifla was shocked by his embarrassed face, as he looked very cute. But in turn, she knew that she had to restrain herself. She recently learned that the Duke had asked for leave. He could not leave the princess with the knight until that suspicious man was caught. Lifla was leisurely strolling along the streets, and for a moment she froze near the store. She looked at the store window with a joyful smile, because she didn't know that shopping could be so fun. She froze for a moment, because she saw a beautiful gift for the Duke. But in turn, she also noticed another gift for Eugene. She looked at the different goods with a joyful smile, but suddenly she heard someone's voice. With the speed of lightning, she turned around and saw a young man who was looking at her with a smile, while the young men looked at him warily. Lifla looked at the young man with a joyful smile and called him by name, but a moment later, she was running towards him, jumping and smiling, saying that he was an angel. Eugene froze in shock, because he didn't understand what she had just said. The Duke looked at the young man intently, wondering if the princess had just called him an angel. The princess smiled and said that it was true, because he himself had said that he was an angel. Eugene froze in shock. Lifla hoped that her knight would try to understand that she and Mr. Angel were just crazy. She smiled, looking at the young man, and said that she was very glad to see him, but did not understand how they managed to meet in such a place. He smiled and said that he knew everything. The young men looked at him with disgust, while the princess gave him a radiant smile. Harris looked at the princess with an innocent smile and invited her to play a little. He promised her that she would have a very good time. After a while, the princess looked at the young man with a puzzled expression and asked him if he really liked what he tried on. He smiled and said that he did. He said with a satisfied smile that it was exactly his taste. She was shocked because his outfit was terrible. In fact, some time ago, the young princess met with Harris. Eugene sighed heavily and said that the young man had rather questionable taste. She was puzzled, because she saw that the handsome men did not get along with each other, and they behaved as if they were sworn enemies. She knew it was very sweet, but she still didn't want them to fight over her. Of course, the young princess was delighted, but she didn't want to faint again. She smiled and, looking at the young people, asked if they all wanted to go shopping together. In the end, they went in search of clothes. The young lady knew that in the original, the female lead had always been cautious with the young man, but now she understood why the female lead acted like this. She was shocked because his style was even worse than in the original novel. Lifla looked closely at the young man and asked if he would like to try on the outfit she would choose. She wanted to get rid of his old outfit as soon as possible, and with the speed of lightning, she began her search. After a long search, she found what she was looking for. Lifla looked at the young man with admiration after he tried on the exquisite outfit she presented him with. She was glad that her sense of style was at the highest level. She looked at him with a smile and said that this outfit looked very nice on him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really buy this outfit for him. The princess smiled and said that this was exactly the case and that he should accept the gift. With lightning speed, she turned around and looked at the saleswomen. She looked at the young ladies with a smile and made an order. She had never known before that searching for outfits could be so much fun. She really wanted to spend money on things like this. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that she was in his debt. A moment later, she presented the young people with a whole mountain of gifts. They were shocked, as they did not expect such a thing. The Duke looked closely at the young people, because he did not understand why the princess was so favorable to the suspicious man. A moment later, he opened the nondescript box, which contained a beautiful brooch from the princess. He looked at the brooch with excitement. A moment later, he thanked the princess for the gift. She smiled and asked if he liked the gift. He smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and she beamed with a joyful smile and said that she liked him too. The Duke looked at the princess with a gentle smile, because he saw that she was having a lot of fun, and he thought that such expenses were not so bad. A moment later, the princess approached her faithful knight and asked him to accept another gift. The young man was taken aback and said that he had already received so much from her. Cherished looked at the princess intently and said that he wanted to ask her something. She smiled and asked what he wanted to know. While eating delicacies from the street, he slowly asked the princess why she didn't buy anything for herself, and for a moment, everyone froze. The princess looked at the young man in surprise, but hesitated to answer. She, in turn, did not understand why she had to buy something for herself, but was still touched by his concern for her. The young princess smiled and said that she was fine and did not need anything. The young people stood still for a moment with sadness on their faces. She looked around shyly because she knew that it was enough for her that the young people were next to her. Cherished looked away from the princess and asked if this was true. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, he turned around and walked in the other direction. The young people froze in silence and bewilderment, looking after him. A few seconds later, the princess told her companions that it was time for them to go. The lady was running in the crowd and asking for forgiveness, asking for the way. But unfortunately, she fell. Madame looked at the lady with fury and said that she was not the only one who was in a hurry. But she did not understand why the lady was pushing like that without any good reason. The lady was furious and did not understand what the girl was doing in such a place. Madame sighed heavily and said that she had come to find out if there was any work in the palace after so many years. But instead, she had to deal with the young lady. The young lady rose up with lightning speed and shook herself. She looked around carefully, as she had heard all the conversations. Everyone present was saying that it seemed like even a villain needed someone to command her, since she was recruiting new staff. Lady Awen. As a child, Bella was not like other girls. She was very interested in management, but after the birth of her younger brother, who became the heir, she could no longer study in the same direction. But she did not give up and continued to study under the pretext of helping her brother. However, her parents, who were watching her, were not at all happy with this. And one day, she found out that they had organized her help. Then she left the house and ran away as far as possible. Unfortunately, the young lady was left with nothing. She chipped in to various acquaintances, but still became a palace servant. She heard her friends talking because they didn't know what to do because they didn't understand accounting. The maid said that if the head maid found out about everything, there would be big problems. So the young lady said that she could help them. She carefully studied all the papers and identified inaccuracies. At that moment, she helped the maids with the account book. But it so happened that the prince noticed her. The prince then appointed the young lady as his personal secretary. At the time, she was embarrassed and flattered by such an offer. The young princess sighed heavily. because she knew that, unfortunately, it was unrequited love. She knew that in the original, after the prince and the main character got married, she dropped everything and hid in some village. But in turn, the princess did not want to let such a treasure just disappear. At the beginning of the story, the young lady was already the prince's new secretary. She knew that most likely the young lady was now staying at her friend's house. The princess looked closely at the headmaid and asked if she could advertise that they were looking for a sales manager. She told Emma that candidates needed to know that she was personally recruiting people and that the sales team was in poor shape. And they also had to inform everyone that the workers would work for pennies. The young princess looked closely at her maid and said that she would look after her and she would not have to worry about money when she became old. The maid looked at the young princess with embarrassment, as she did not expect such a thing. The young lady knew that if the girl worked for her, she would be able to live in abundance until old age. She knew that everything had been going smoothly lately. Even the memories of the young princess were peaceful. Lifla thought for a moment, as she knew that things were going well with the side characters, and she only needed to deal with her Angels Guild. She knew it was a little weird to say something like that, but she was going to intervene because she didn't want him to fall for the main character's tears. She wanted to fight for the future of a completely crazy young man who really loved the tears of the main character. The young man looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that she seemed to be in a very good mood. She beamed when she saw the young man. He sighed heavily and said that she smiled every time he came. Lifla said with a smile that he was very interesting. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was talking about. Lifla looked at him intently and began to speak, but suddenly heard someone's voice. She turned around with a joyful smile and told the Duke that he could come in. The Duke slowly entered the room and asked the princess for forgiveness for disturbing her. Lifla looked at the Duke with a gentle smile and said that he could join them. The young princess said with a smile that she was just talking to Mr. Angel. The Duke looked at the young man with a sharp and angry look. A moment later, he turned his gaze to the young princess and asked with a smile if she had slept well. She smiled and said that she was fine and had slept very well. Harris looked at the princess in surprise and asked if she really liked the Duke so much. The Duke looked coldly at the young man and asked if he couldn't speak to the princess more politely. The Duke was very angry because the young man did not show respect to the princess. The princess looked closely at the young people as she saw that the situation between them was very tense. She was surprised, and at the same time, she didn't understand why they were arguing so childishly. She laughed. Harris looked at the princess with alarm and asked if she was really crying. Barely holding back her laughter, she said that this was not so. Harris sighed heavily and said that he didn't know what to do, because even if he surprised her, it wouldn't work, and he couldn't just kill her. The Duke looked at the young man with a cold, intent gaze, for he knew that to leave him was simply a dangerous thing to do. With the speed of lightning, he blocked the princess with his body, but the young lady in turn calmly looked at them. He sighed heavily, as he understood that throwing the young man out right now was the best solution. A moment later, he used his magic and summoned his sword, but the young man gracefully dodged his opponent's sword. With lightning speed, he jumped softly onto the balcony. He looked at the princess intently and said with a smile that he would come back again when the tension subsided. The young lady sighed heavily and said after the young man that he was very interesting. The Duke looked at my lady with alarm and said that the young man was very dangerous. Lifla smiled and apologized to the Duke for making him worry. She knew he was spending his entire vacation just to be with her. He looked at her sheepishly and said that he was very glad about it. Kane looked closely at the young princess and said with a smile that he had more free time now, so he could spend it on her. It took longer than she expected, but the announcement she made a while ago finally paid off. In front of her now sat the 5 final candidates that Emma had sent to her.